In the book, we're looking at chapter 7, soul and spirit and ego, and we're focusing on 7.1 and 7.2. So we're looking at soul and market, and then as time permits, we'll go on into spirit and soul. We talked about soul and market last week, but not everybody was here last week, and not everybody is here this week. So we were sort of hoping that, yeah.
I looked at the recording.
Oh, did you?
Yeah.
Do you have questions, comments, concerns?
I did. Well, I felt like I was part of the matrix after listening to it. And I liked what Joseph said about the abstraction, that everything's abstraction, and how Sharon educated me about cows in the dark. I had no idea. So there was a lot of learning there. And I feel like sometimes when Joseph was trying to talk about everything is abstracted, and then I was thinking of Silicon Valley and how our inner desire, our mythos, is actually being quantified and taken advantage of it. And it's almost like they are acting as if they're gods in order to grant our greatest wishes without even having to do anything but click a button, as long as we have the do-re-mi, the money. So those are my thoughts.
Good thoughts. I've been thinking about something you said a few weeks ago. We were talking about code switching and how people from marginalized parts of a society, when they're trapped into marginalized roles, they have to learn how to switch between the language and terminology and behavior of the dominant privileged classes and their own more original marginalized classes. And the indigenous peoples have to learn to do this a lot, but they have to learn to talk white in certain circumstances in order to not be punished for existing as somebody who's not originally white, and that they'll be rewarded to a certain extent for the extent to which they erase their own identity and become the other thing. So we were talking about that in the context of modernism and the way that the current world system wants us to behave in ways that destroy the world for short-term profit. And how do we reconcile that and survive in a market economy like that when at the same time we're trying to develop an heuristic alternative to this Banausic culture? And in the middle of that discussion, you piped up and said, yeah, but what's needed is not more adaptation to this broken system. What's needed is that people stand up against it and present alternatives and really, really do everything in their power to bring to life the alternatives that we all need to live according to instead of this mess. And I've been thinking about it ever since that you said that. That it's true that we only get 24 hours in a day, and if the more of that we invest into adapting to a broken system, the more we perpetuate the broken system. And so there is this challenge, do I do what rewards me economically in the short term by learning to code switch? Or do I put more energy into the thing that I'm going to be economically punished for in the short term, but that might allow us to survive in the long term if we can enrich and develop this alternative, heuristic culture? So I'm still.
Can I just give it off that, because
sure.
I hate to be pessimistic. Sorry, Phil. I hate to be a pessimist, but I think what she's talking about is in the DNA of the culture. And I'm going to share an experience. So I'm at work one night, and it is almost midnight, and I've been there since 7 in the morning, and I have one more hip to do, one more fractured hip. So I tell the orderly to bring the patient down. The operating room is on the ground. He comes back and says, Dr. Townsend, I can't bring it because her son wants to see you, and he's not going to see you. Not going to allow me to bring her down to the seats. So it means I have to take the elevator and go up there. And the nurse tells him that Dr. Townsend's coming. So I walk in the room, and I'm telling you, I should have had a camera. You should have seen the shock on this man's face. A name like Townsend doesn't give give it away. I am a Black person, and then I'm a woman, right? And so, because I'm so tired, I looked at him and I said, well, you know, sir, this is the name my slave owners gave me, right? And he turned red. He walked over to me and he put his hand on his shoulder. And what he was doing, she tells him my name, so he expects probably a white guy.
Yeah.
A little Black woman shows up and he is shocked. And he can't, and the occurrence happens so quickly that he can't contain his surprise. And I'm a little irritated because it's almost midnight, you know? But he apologized profusely to that unsaid few moments because he figured out what he had done. So I hear what you say, Marianne, but I think it's in the DNA of this culture. And I think it will take generations to change it.
Yeah.
Yeah, but the problem is that is only if you could retain enough of your original culture to recuperate it. What we've done to the American Indians, I think they're beginning to recuperate, is that they were so confused that they've lost their identity, at least some of the tribes, that they couldn't recuperate it to fight against it. And that's really different from the Black culture, Black American culture. Despite all the oppression that it suffered, they seemed to retain a Black identity that they could fight back. I think that's the difference. That in a sense they were much more activists because they understood in a sense that they were enslaved and oppressed. I was always surprised, at least by the Black intellectuals, how they sort of supported each other and held together in a way. I mean, surprised to the degree that, you know, when I was at Oberlin, you know, like, what's her name? I forgot her name again. The poet that was in the presidential.
Maya Angelou.
Maya Angelou, that's right. I knew of her, but I was surprised she came to Oberlin because to celebrate Odetta's birthday, because Odetta was giving a concert there. And, you know, all the Blacks intellectuals in that town and possibly from elsewhere came. And I was invited only because the local Black faculty knew me and I was invited, and they didn't know that I actually didn't know Maya Angelou. So that was instrumental in them recuperating. If the white settlers had been more successful in obliterating that culture, that unity, then it would have been much, much more difficult. And that's why the American Indian movement finally had to abandon a degree of the tribal allegiance to form a unity across the tribes to achieve that. So sometimes you could actually deconstruct that to such a degree that it's almost impossible to recuperate.
I was actually thinking about what Phil said about Beethoven a little bit. And I had this kind of joke in my head. In the 60s, we used to say the revolution would not be televised. And I'm thinking the revolution will be in the music and maybe in the movies, but not television.
Yeah. Yeah, ain't that the truth? Gil Scott-Heron, the revolution will not be televised. I grew up in the 70s listening to funk music. And, you know, as part of the constellation around funk music, there was soul, and God help us, there was disco, but there was also, you know, some really great Black liberation music that was part of that scene, and it was woven into funk in all kinds of ways as well. But some of the musicians directly embraced it and said, look, we're just going to talk directly about racism and about slavery and about oppression and about how you survive. And I loved Gil Scott-Heron's music for that he was he was not afraid to stand up and say, you know what? this shit is not going to work. This has got to be changed, and we should all be, getting ready for that and doing what we can to make it happen. There's a food series, a cooking series on right now, and I wish I could remember the name. I've been watching it. It's a black food critic, and what he's doing is tracing the history of black food in America back to Africa. And
Yes,
he
I've seen
actually,
it. Netflix.
have you seen it? You remember what it's called?
No, but I look it up on Netflix because I'm enjoying it because I've been to most of those places.
It's
And that's
incredible.
good. Yes.
It's incredible. And the opening, the very first episode, I don't care how much, a white American may have managed to avoid thinking about slavery or the impact of slavery. Even if you're the whitest of white Americans, you watch that first episode and it's like a sock to the gut, because he goes back to the road that the slaves were marched down in Africa, with the gateway at the end to where they boarded the ships and never came home.
Yes.
And he's like, I exist because my ancestors walked down this road. And so he explores the food of that whole region. And what are they cooking? What are they making? How does their relationship to the land? And how much of that was recreated in America by people who didn't want to lose everything, who wanted to preserve what they could of their culture. And there's a scene where he has all episode long been holding his shit together, but finally, when he's looking at the monument that's been constructed around that gate by the ocean, and he's looking at the statues, and he's thinking about, he finally breaks down and starts crying. And oh my God, you just cry with him. You can't. You just
Can
can't.
I just come in here? It's called, I think the series is called High on the Hog.
Yes.
And because I'm part of the African diaspora, I can tell you, I travel a lot. And one of the fascinating things is most of the slaves to Jamaica came from Ghana, which is the west coast of Africa. And my heritage is, my father is a direct descendant of slaves. My mother is a planter. And because he was a direct descendant of slaves, we were exposed to the culture from his side. And when you travel, you get to see how the slaves that came to the Caribbean obtained the food, customs, the dance, the burial rites, the marriage rites, even though they were isolated. So to Phil's point, and if you could look, I don't know how much resistance the American Indian had, but our national heroes in Jamaica, the logo, are all slave resistant fighters. And the moment we got independence, all those other statues came down and put those out. And so the retention of the culture through the customs of the food. When I go to other Caribbean islands, when you go to Trinidad, for example, which is very, very Indian, and the Indians came in, the Indians and the Chinese came after the emancipation as indentured slaves. And you can also see the tension of the culture there. The food, the important rites, marriage, weddings, right, and the dance. And the dance is always something that has fascinated. So when I go back to Africa, right, because I've traced my lineage back there, I've forgotten which tribe I'm from, right, and I see and I see the custom, I feel very excited because one of the things as a Black person, like the guy who thinks that Dr. Townsend and he's shot, that's not my name. That's not who I am. You know? That's my English name. My slave master gave this to me. And so I don't know who I am. And that's a critical part of your identity.
Well, you know, an important thing is not that you retain your identity to the degree that you don't accept other points of view, but you have to retain your identity to be able to synthesize in a mature way with other cultures and other traditions. But when that's destroyed, then in a sense you cannot really enter the other person. That's why I suggested, sarcastically, that you needed to spend some time in a Chinese re-education camp because they will obliterate more more, and in a way, more powerfully than brute force,
Mhm.
because they will eliminate your identity. So that that's important to know, that you're not trying to like go back to the origins, that you're going to stay there. It's just that you need to be who you are in order to blossom into who you could be.
Well,
And
that's important too, because you have to decide as a person. And my father taught me this. Yes, this is what our race endured, and this is where we are now. So we have to be who we are and move on from this. Because to continue to live in the past is to rob yourself of being the very, very best that you can be.
And
And huh?
I think that it's interesting in what your father said, because I think it's almost existentialism, because when you choose to be yourself, you are choosing not to be in the matrix any longer. So this guy can just look really weird, but you're not in that matrix. So it is kind of this inner safe space, and it's very daring of you to be there.
Yes, 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 yes. And in fact, I was kind of sad. I don't know if anybody's been following the news where the Canadians, how they try to obliterate the indigenous culture of the First Peoples by putting these kids in schools, and they were run by Catholics, and now they're finding all these dead kids in the ground under the schools, right? And
They put
that's how
pedophiles in there.
yes, yes, and that is that's sad. It's a sad commentary on the way we
Yeah. It's a subject near and dear to my heart. I follow these stories closely and write about them on Facebook at some length. And part of what's horrific, even more horrific than what's coming out in Canada, is that the only reason it's coming out is that Canada has gone further than we have towards truth and reconciliation. We did the exact same thing in the United States, but we refused to ever set up a commission to investigate what we did or to document it. And so, Canadians, Euro Canadians are starting to suspect, because of this work that's been done, they're starting to be exposed to the truth of what they've done, what their government's done, what their churches have done. But in the United States, there's still huge numbers of Americans who tell themselves, "Oh, we're better than that. We didn't do that." Like they who believe that the Indians either all died out a long time ago and there aren't any more, or that after the period of active genocide, that was the end of it. There wasn't any cultural genocide that followed. And so we're more clueless about the number of bodies that we have buried at boarding schools across this country, because we haven't had the courage to lift the lid and start digging to see what we did.
But I think we're getting better though. Tulsa.
Yeah.
I mean, when I first moved to America, I watched a movie called Rosewood, and I looked up the other day. There are about 25 cities and towns in this country that kind of massacre occurred, right? And I was very impressed with the fact. In fact, I give that credit to Donald Trump. I want him to go to Tulsa, and he's right. He brought Tulsa into the forefront. He brought it into the general discourse. I got to give him the things he did right, right? And so everybody was now talking about it. And they said, no, you can't come there on that day. And then some people started asking why,
Right.
And it was his audacity that he wanted to do that. But that happens in many cities. And why? Because the culture utilized the marketplace really well, and it ran afoul of the opposite race.
Right. Yeah, I'm going to give another example of this, and it's all to set up the larger discussion for today. But another example of the ways in which we live in an abstraction when it comes to understanding ourselves and our history is the way in which, in the United States, many people who live in the West or in the North scapegoat the South for racism. And they say, well, the South was racist and the South didn't like Black people, but, the rest of us fought for Black people. So we get a free pass on racism because, we were on the right side. And of course, part of what that obscures is that and this is something that is almost never taught in American schools. Why was there a fight over whether slave states or slave-free states would be the fate of the new states to the West? What were they arguing about? And the way that I was taught in school, and I think most Americans were taught, is that they were trying to maintain a balance of power between the slave-owning states and the non-slave-owning states. That's what we were all told. We were like, yeah, the North just wanted to make sure that the South, couldn't impose slavery too widely. And so we were trying to maintain a balance. But it turns out that's false history. That history was invented later to excuse the North from the real reason. And the real reason is that there are enormous numbers of highly racist people in the North as well. And they couldn't stand the Southern lifestyle because you're constantly surrounded by Black people. And they're like, the reason that we don't want to have Black slaves is so we don't have to be around Black people. We want our states to be all white. And so for them, the prospect of slave owning states wasn't just about, there being more slave owning states who could outvote them in Congress. It was, oh my God, Black people will spread across this country. We have to keep the West pure. We have to keep it white. And so that's why they forced there to be this compromise. And part of the way that you know that this is true is when you look at housing covenants and you look at state laws and you look at the history of purges in the West, you see how often Western states were originally set up to be a white paradise. The state of Oregon was originally meant to be a white paradise. They did everything in their power to keep Black people out. Washington State, Idaho, all three of these states have always had a very long history of extreme white supremacy. And that's because that's not an aberration. It's not because white supremacists came into the West and contaminated what had been set up as a good system. It's because from the very outset, the idea that there would be no slaves in Washington, Oregon, or Idaho had less to do with, respect for the rights of Black people and a lot more to do with white people not wanting to be around Black people. And if there were slaves, there'd be Black people around. And that would be gross, they thought, right? This was their argument.
Here's the fascinating thing to me. I've lived in America for, 45 or 50 or by years. And I hear that discussion, but I don't think the behavior or the unconscious behavior has changed. Look at all the discussion about critical race theory.
Yes.
I had to look that up. I didn't know what it meant.
Yes.
Look at all the voter suppression laws. That's why I think it's going to be right? And I think, look at the inequities, the construction of highways, the construction of houses. Pandemic just ripped the Band-Aid off the inequities of healthcare.
Right.
Everyone. So, I mean, it's like I'm looking at the philosophy, I'm studying philosophy here, and I'm trying to extrapolate what it says to my life today, to the life I see today. But when I try to extrapolate events like that, I see more of the same. And it bothers because it's a pattern of thought, it's a way of understanding, which I think we're not ready to let go of.
Right. Right. And you got to think about, Marx talked a lot about the concept of false consciousness. He says, part of what's key to making capitalism run is to make sure that the proletariat never has a clear understanding of the power dynamic between themselves and the bourgeoisie. Because if they ever understood how much they're being deprived of and how artificial it is, how unnecessary it is, they might rise up. And so it's critical to always be brainwashing the proletariat so that they have no idea what their real circumstances are. Now, we read something like that in theory or abstracto, and we're like, maybe, maybe not, maybe he's exaggerating. But then you say, what does it mean when generation after generation after generation of Americans don't understand what the balance of slave versus not slave owning states in the spread West was about? When they imagine that it was about, noble ideals that were taught in school, and they can't visualize the idea that the North and South might both have been racist, that white people in both places might have been not just a little racist, but very racist, and that they expressed it in different ways. And because it sort of suggests that rather than there being a good side and a bad side, and you can be lucky enough to be on the good side, it suggests what we had is two bad sides who were arguing about, how they were going to go about doing the racist things that they wanted to do. And then there were other people who were opposed to that, but weren't in power in either place. It creates a much more complicated, much less pleasant picture of our history. And it's easy to see why we wouldn't want that. We wouldn't want to think about that. We wouldn't want to talk about that. We'd want to treat every outbreak of white supremacy throughout the West and throughout the North as a coincidence every single time and say, well, these are just intruders coming in from the South, bringing their racism with them. We don't like the idea that they were always here in the North, because the North and the West were always racist this way, wherever we were. It's a massive program of education that has happened to get Americans to the point where we're so confused about one of the most basic features of the way that we spread and why we spread the way that we did.
Well, it just seems to me like it's always more difficult to fight against the invisible than the visible. It was very obvious that the South, all that, all that effort was very visible, right?
Mhm.
I'm thinking about Tulsa, Oklahoma. The problem was not that there was blacks in a way, but they were successful in playing the same game as the whites.
Yes.
That is making it visible, and that's dangerous.
More
As long as they
successful.
could sort of like be hidden under the thing, and you could say, oh, we'll let them be because they're not that successful after all. Then, in a sense, you still are proven a kind of superiority. But when they showed that itself to be successful in the same game, then that really becomes dangerous. And you have to stop that. And I think that's where the problem is, because they were manifesting the visibility of what was visible. So I think, like, as long as we could keep it hidden, then in a sense, we could ignore it to a degree, because, like, I'm a good guy. Like, don't blame me, right? It's too bad you guys are not successful. But when you're successful, I'm actually a little bit more threatened, because you could be as good as I am, maybe even better than I am. I can't accept that. So that's a problem.
So I tried to figure this out again over the weekend.
Yeah.
Because all of what we're talking about is behavior. It's human behavior based on perception. And
Yes.
so the sentence that we ended with last week was Merleau-Ponty's structure of behavior. And I sat down and I tried to read it, and I was lost. Right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So that brings me right back to this point. Structure of behavior as it impacts our daily life, as it impacts the markets, as it impacts the judicial system, as it impacts everything, because that's a foundational concept.
Right. Right. And I'm gonna confess, I still haven't read Merleau-Ponty's structure of behavior, despite the fact that that was the homework I set myself for this week. I got distracted by things earlier in that same chapter, and went down those rabbit holes and never came out until today. So I still have to read that. Oh, aha!
Donald,
You have it.
So you are
dissertation,
human.
Donald.
So you are human.
Yeah, Joe.
Way to
mean-
go, Donald.
That
Well,
made
I
me feel a
think
lot
I think
better,
this
actually.
copy is unread.
Oh no!
I'm sure it's something that Kenneth put in a box and told me I had to buy.
Uh-huh. Oh yes.
But I did read one thing, not completely yet, but Bergson, Introduction to Metaphysics,
Ah.
which strangely parallels lots of Kenneth's arguments, especially on, Bergson calls it interior versus exterior, but it's
What's it called? The book?
An Introduction to Metaphysics by Henri Bergson.
Thank you.
Yeah. Let me put a couple of links in the chat.
But it's what does Hegel use and Kenneth, the being for itself and
Yes.
being for another and
Being in itself, being
In
for
itself.
itself,
in
and being
itself.
in and for itself.
Yeah. And
Those
it's,
are Hegel's three.
well, Bergson doesn't use Hegel's terminology like that, but he clearly argues along the same lines. And in fact, well, actually, he doesn't argue. And I'll make something point about Kenneth. Nowhere in anything that I have ever read by Kenneth is there what one would call a Banausic argument. There are observations. There are just assertions,
Judgments.
judgments.
He's very value judgy.
Very bad. His connoisseurial judgment that he urges everyone, he just lays this stuff out. There's not like in much of written philosophy where you try to find some common ground and then argue forward. This is not Spinoza. Kenneth, by and large, doesn't even talk about how you get to this insight. He just says, I've been thinking about this and this is what I see. And when you go read Bergson, he talks about intuition, that one intuits the internality of the other and comes to know it as it knows itself.
Yes.
So that one understands its own internal laws, its own forms, drives, whatever. So I actually found in about 50 pages of Bergson quite a new insight into Kenneth's way of presenting things, and it's,
Yes.
it's right. No, and I wanted to say one thing kind of to Sharon, or maybe to anybody. In my career, I've worked, especially here in Arizona, I've worked with Blacks, Native Americans, lots of Asians of either Chinese or Korean or Indian, whatever. And they're remarkably the same. They all have masters in either electrical engineering or computer science or possibly PhDs, and they're remarkably homogeneous. So they seem to be other engineers, largely just like me. And I've been wondering what all this cultural controversy is about. We just haven't succeeded in running enough people through graduate school yet.
Donald, can I respond to that?
You may.
As human beings, right? I think human spirit has some basic qualities. Like we all want to be the very best that we can be. Those engineers that come here from India or China or wherever, they're all the same. I came here as a physician, we're all the same. But you have to function in a perceptual grid that becomes an obstacle.
Mhm.
And I am very, very glad that you said they're all the same, because what you were looking at was their technical skills. And you did not put them under your perception. And that's the healthy way to be. For example, Donald, I went to a multiracial school in Jamaica, because Jamaica is a multi-ethnic culture. When I came to America, they said, oh, so-and-so is Jewish. I said, well, what do you mean? My class was full of Jewish girls. I said, I'm Black. I said, well, what does that mean? So this one is white. So I was sure, Kincaid, her name was Janet Kincaid. She's a big international photographer. She was a white girl with blonde hair. I never saw her as a white girl because the motto of the culture was out of many, one people. That's our national motto. And we lived it. You were Jamaican first. That's before you were white or Black or Chinese or Indian. And what we did with all the things that we brought, I learned to like Chinese food, Indian food, because of the different nationalities that came, but it was all part of this huge melting pot. And I hope with all my heart that we will get there one day. it's a goal to keep striving for, and I know we will.
Well, I have a comment too. Like, I am Chinese, and when I went to school at Berkeley, every Asian was in some kind of technical thing, biochemistry, engineering, or some kind of business thing, or that sort of thing. I felt really different because I was an artist. And I often resented people that try to categorize me as Chinese because I was very, very different. It was difficult to find another Chinese person, at least at that time, that was in the arts. So I think that there's some limitation to even bracketing people within a certain culture or origins because each person is different to a certain degree. In fact, when I was beginning teaching, just beginning, some wise old man told me, Phil, you have to play up this Chinese thing. Right? Because like that's how you're gonna move in the world. And I actually just resent that. I did like scoffed at him. I sort of nodded politely, but this is nonsense. I am who I am. As a matter of fact, when I went to college, like I said, in high school, even I was a fairly accomplished art student. And I wanted to, in a sense, synthesize the Eastern tradition with the Western tradition. It did nothing but got me into trouble because I did not have a deep enough understanding of the Eastern culture. And finally, a teacher told me, like, why are you burdening yourself with this task? He said, if you truly wanted to do that, it will come out in its own form because you would be committed to that rather than try to synthesize an external thought that you have. He said, just be who you are and it will come out one way or the other. And that comment in a funny way liberated me to be who I was without having to like, oh, it is my responsibility to knit these opposites together. I just became who I was, and as best I could, being who I was, rather than having the monumental task of Atlas holding up the world. I couldn't do that.
I went to
go ahead,
the
Marianne.
Fry Art Museum recently, and Atlas was there, but it was the art of Harlem in the old days. And it was a Black person, a waiter holding up the world. And how I interpreted that was that he was holding up his own world. He had a good job, he was taking care of things. And in his life, he was holding up the world. And I loved that we had talked about it and I saw them and I felt it was very verdant of him to make that.
It's brilliant. Brilliant.
Very nice.
Yeah, one of the things that one of the things that the United States is still, I think, centuries behind on is with immigration. I mean, the way, and I mean, Phil had actually just mentioned, there are a lot of Asian people that are in engineering classes. We only let them in because for that reason in certain cases. I mean, so we don't let, unfortunately, artists in, and I think that this is really one of the great losses of it goes way beyond 9/11. 9/11 was part of it. Immigration became much harder after that, but before that, our immigration policies are just so outdated, and that the fact that we only let certain people in with certain skill sets is kind of appalling, to be quite honest, because it says that you are this, that you are just this is your job, and this is what you are. And people are so much more than that. And in fact, we need more artists more than anything right now, I would say. I mean, we certainly don't need, and I'm no offense to anybody, engineers. But I mean, I didn't want to say it. I had to say it. I had to, but I am sorry. But we I mean, we've got enough. And but I'm just saying.
I'm actually with you. I agree.
I mean,
Right? We can build nuclear bombs. We've got that down pat. But when it comes to learning not to be racist, we can sort of use some culture work.
Or culture, I mean, in general.
But if you're a utilitarian society, you're looking to turn people into instruments.
I know.
And that's the problem, rather than valuing them for who they are in a more quieter way that could contribute, right? So therefore, you need so many of these to operate. So in that sense, you only are not treating them as a human being. Right. You're treating them as an instrument for the motive
means
to profit the structure of your society. I think that's where the deep problem really is.
Yeah.
Well, I am paid. One second, was architect, I think.
That's right.
Not an engineer, right? And he was Chinese. I think he was born in China.
He was Chinese, yes.
So
well, he celebrated.
Architects are fine too.
He celebrated in China as well.
well, I think when the Aristoi rule, they're going to find that they need a lot of people that just make markets and build things and do stuff. I mean, even in like Plato's Republic or in Athens of the Golden Age, they're like 60,000 people and they're like 6,000 Aristoi. There's still people that work the silver mines, make pottery, do all kinds of stuff. Oh, and there's one thing, Rick, that I always love to point out. I think there were 3 slave states that fought with the Union. It's true the Confederacy was all slave states, but some slave states fought with the Union. And that always surprises me. I think it was Kentucky, Maryland, Missouri, maybe it was 4. I don't know. It's some small number, but I don't know what it means. Maybe you can figure out what it means.
I had forgotten about that. I used to know that and I'd forgotten about it. And man, talk about a neglected area in my own education about the Civil War. I should have worked on that, right? And tried to understand it. And I haven't. And thank you for reminding me.
I'm recommitting to that next year, actually.
On this topic, I don't know how many ever visit the edX platform. The edX platform is the group of Ivy League schools, Harvard, and they give lectures. Well, Eric Foner out of Columbia gives 2 very, very good series on the Civil War, Joseph.
Oh, really?
Look it up. And it's there now. The course has been archived, but you can certainly access it. And it is very well. He also wrote a book, but he's written many books, but the one that I enjoyed the most was about the Underground Railroad, right? Which is about the actual network and the culture that went along with that network. So when I hear Rick talk about the guns, that Watson and Harriet Tubman had a gun, not to shoot the aggressors, but to keep the people going. Eric Foner talked about the culture of that whole escaping movement, right? Yeah. So those are 2 very, very good lectures on the edX platform.
If you could type the name of that platform in the chat.
It's edX?
Yeah.
Yes.
I would like to follow up.
Here, I'll put it in.
Oh, you've watched them too, right?
Yes. Yeah.
I'd like to see this. So
and it's Eric Foner from Columbia who gives the talks.
All of this is a way to sort of circle around some of the recent events and their implications. You know, the discovery of the bodies in the residential schools, which anybody following the history knew was there,
Right.
but the population at large didn't know, and most of the people who knew they were there didn't want to think about it. I mean, like the Catholic Church didn't want to think about it because it's a whole can of worms. If they take responsibility for what they did, there are going to be countless lawsuits. I mean, how do you make restitution for that? And worse, even if you make restitution in somehow, some way for the dead bodies, how do you make restitution for the living bodies whose cultures you tried to exterminate?
Mhm.
When you're the most noble expression of your stated interest was to eradicate a religion and a culture and a language and a way of life and erase it completely from the face of the planet, when that was the noblest version of your goal. And there are worse versions in the bodies, as the bodies depict. You know, it's like, where's your point of entry if you're the modern day Catholic Church for having those discussions in a litigious society? You can see why they were massively motivated to keep it buried and keep it not talked about, keep it outside the frame of discussion. And so it really goes I must have spent 4 hours writing a long essay in response to the second discovery, the 751 bodies, because the 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 cleric, Father Stefano Penna, who they interviewed, he said, well, you know, terrible things were done, and I can understand why people would be angry, right? But if you give in to that anger and you start putting graffiti on churches, you know, anger is what caused the genocide in the first place. And so really it's all the same thing. And we don't want to go there. And we should be better than that. Which all at first, especially if you're raised in an anger phobic culture, like a lot of us have been, at first it seems reasonable until you realize that he's trying to reduce the attempted genocide of 100 million people to a matter of somebody being angry on the one hand, which diminishes it to such a point that it takes it away from being something so epochally evil that it's almost sacred in its evilness, what happened to these continents, and trying to reduce it down to someone losing his temper at a bar and getting angry and spray painting something. The level of what I want to say blasphemy
Right.
involved in doing that is inconceivable. It represents, and this was the essay that I wrote, it represents moral incompetence to equate things that are so different from each other in an attempt to brush one of them aside. And it also does the opposite with regard to the actual, I don't know if you guys saw the image that was painted on the door of the cathedral in response, but it was red handprints, some of which dragged down the door. And the only words there said, "We were children." And it was painted by an indigenous woman. And she went there and did it as a sacred ceremony. She did it quietly and calmly and with deliberation as her attempt to do justice to the moment and say, how can there be a Catholic Church in Canada that doesn't talk openly and directly about this terrible legacy? It's one of the most important things in the world. And yet it's invisible. It's nowhere to be seen. So she put it where it needed to be seen. And she didn't do it in anger. And there were witnesses to that. But he attempted to distort what she did, right? I mean, in my mind, what she did is comparable to Martin Luther nailing the 95 Theses on the church door is a repudiation of the corruption of the church and the launch of Protestantism. Now, that moment in history was epoch making, right? It led to a revolution in religion and in culture and civilization. What she did is even more potent because it's not about a disagreement about theology or about redemption. It's about actual literal crimes at a scale of which we've never seen in the world before. I mean, attempted genocide of 100 million people is a unique thing. We've never had anything at that level. And she found a way to boil it down to a small number of red handprints and 3 words in the most perfect, poignant, pointed, unforgettable way I can think of. So to attempt to take a moment like that in history and equate it with Nazi graffiti on a Jewish church, which was the new Jewish synagogue, which was the metaphor that he was making, is equally an act of blasphemy to trying to reduce the genocide to an act. He actually warped both things in such a way as to make himself seem like the victim, and really it's about me and my church, and why do you malefactors have to do these things just because you're angry? It's just because we nearly exterminated 2 continents full of people, that's no reason to spray angry graffiti around. To which, at the center of my essay, the thing that I wrote is, so let's talk about it. What then is the modern, civilized, law-abiding, proper, polite response to the largest genocide in history? What is the correct, measured, calm, with no anger at all? Because as we know, anger's evil and nobody's ever supposed to get angry about anything, which is why, angry black men is like a phobia for white Americans. Nobody's ever supposed to get angry.
Angry black woman.
Right? No matter what we did to anybody, nobody's ever supposed to get angry. You all have to cater to my feelings and be as calm as possible, and maybe, but probably not, I might listen to you. So under those circumstances, what is the appropriate, suitable response to the attempted genocide of 100 million people? And the answer is, there isn't one. Within the frame of modernism and modern behavior, it's impossible to respond in an appropriate moral way to the scale of these moral catastrophes. They're the only way to do justice to the legacy of slavery of modernism, to do justice to the legacy of genocide of modernism, the warfare, the ecocide, so many things. The only way is to break the frame of modernism and respond in an inappropriate way. Because modernism keeps itself going by framing us in at a level at which we can't actually challenge the big, scary things that it does. If we could, it wouldn't be able to keep going. So that's the whole point of it. And he was clearly not seeing that. So that's what I'm coming into today's session with, is I'm coming into today's session with this concept of the abstraction that we're expected to follow for who are we supposed to be as people and as a society, versus the existential critique of, but who are we actually, naturally? What is our human nature, the nature within us and around us? What are our actual circumstances, and how far apart are these banausic Verstand abstractions from our actual circumstances, and what does that cost us? So a whole series of hands I see. I guess Sharon, then Phil, then Marianne.
Well, this is a real hot button for me, because I think we are very far apart. And let me go to modern day. The Catholic cardinals are trying to vote to deny Joe Biden communion. And I'm not being political here. Why? Because he supports abortion rights activists. However, when you look back on their history, and I don't know if anybody read a big story in the New York Times, the children of Tuam in Ireland. That's another place. It's a home for unwed mothers where they found 973 dead babies in the yard. That's Catholicism, right? When you visit I think I was in Ecuador, and you talk to the Mosquitoes, how the Jesuits betrayed them and had them shot, and killed, and buried, right? So I do not know if that tension between say we are and who we really are will ever be resolved. And so when I meet somebody who is atheist, in fact, I give another personal anecdote. One of my colleagues died recently, and he was my age, and I was very upset. So I said, when are we having the funeral? They said, we're not having any. And when I probed, said, he was from South America, he's a Catholic, and here's a 68-year-old man who was molested by a priest, and he took him to his grave. Now, that was very stunning for me. The fact that he came from Peru. And so I hope nobody, well, if anybody here is Catholic, I'm not going to apologize because this is a fact, right? It's institutionalized evil. That's just the way I see it. And the fact that the cardinal have the audacity to challenge Joe Biden's stance, to challenge his communion taking, because he has not supported the activists, or he's not says he's pro-life. He's just been kind of mum about it, kind of weak-kneed at that. And they're challenging him on it, right? It's right in that divide that you're talking about. It's institutional. It's pretending. And
Right.
this is a real hot button of mine. So when I meet somebody who's atheist, I am not judgmental. I'm curious as to why they believe what they believe and why they got there. Because there's the theology of a faith, and then there's the practice of a faith. And the two things are very different.
Right.
And you have to decide how you're going to organize your life.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm going to continue this issue in a personal way,
Please.
because there's so many institutional structures that inhibit you from being liberated to think freely. When I was a graduate student, like I said, I had the opportunity to work as an assistant photographer for the Lowy Museum of Anthropology. It's a wonderful, wonderful museum that actually affected my art. I was at that time a painter, and I sort of abandoned painting, which sort of shocked everybody at that time, because it had exhausted me in a sense of like, I had learned what I needed to learn, and I was trying to find a different way of doing art. And particularly the American Indian art at that time really inspired me, not because I understood American Indian culture, but because they were so personal and intimate in its relationship to their lives, right? And I immediately recognized that personal relationship of the art to what they do, rather than art as a kind of professional thing. I was always curious to the degree that so-called primitive, I'll put it in quotes, primitive art is put in the Museum of Anthropology. I mean, oceanic art, to a certain degree, African art, and certainly American Indian art, and other art form, even though some of them are other, are in museums, like Chinese art, Japanese art. They were different, but they were respected because of a certain culture of respect. Then other things like Egyptian art, which should be in the Museum of Anthropology, is in museums of art. And certainly, of course, Greek art and Roman art is in museums of art plus Western art. So in a funny sense, that segregation, that it's okay to look at American Indian stuff because they were, in a sense, dead. So it's okay to put them in a museum of anthropology because it's over and done with. And so you could kind of look at them as like a past culture, but in fact, they were just a lifetime away, not like Egyptian art, which is like 1,000 years away. So that was interesting to me, that in a sense that this respect and the level of otherness that you can reach. So in a sense, when Picasso did his first Cubist painting, that he used African masks, now that is in a museum, but not African masks as such. I like it's just sort of like, it's just startling to me, you know. Yes, you could say, of course, I respect art. I love art. So I'm not trying to slam art. I'm just trying to slam in the sense how institutions could, in a sense, minimalize and to a certain degree dehumanize a certain culture where others are raised up. Like Babylonian art, that's okay, even though it's other. That is like part of our tradition in a way. So in some sense, I think that kind of otherness, this level of otherness, you could actually put something away that's less than 100 years old at that time in anthropology. And like I said, I was shocked when the American California Indians came to the Lowy Museum of Anthropology and learn how to basket weave because it was a dead art.
Mhm.
It was an anthropologist, not a craft, not an art form that they had to learn about their culture. They were so removed from them that they had to relearn that. That was so surprising to what degree we were successful in making a culture that still should be
Right.
living and breathing dead, that they had to like learn from anthropologists. So we do allow anthropology to exist, but not in the art museum. I hope that changes.
Yeah, me too. Thank you, Phil. Marianne and then Joseph.
Oh, I'm unmuted. Okay. So I think, Donald, when you talk about the era stories coming and ruling, I don't think that's going to happen. It's the sociopaths that will be ruling us continuously. And I also think about anger. Donald Trump is terribly angry and everybody's okay with it. And I've been trying to sort out in my head about Kenneth, and I want to really understand this. It's like totalitarianism, there's like a conformity to it. And then he talks about infantilizing things, like there's almost this thing. And then he equated like the bliss factor, religion, and all these things together. And I really wanted to get my head around that. And I think that the human nature, like, is it part of our human nature to really want to default into this very dependent, conformist, we're okay if we think like everybody else instead of having to find out who we are? I think there's something there. And I also think that like when he's talking about safe spaces, like in Ireland, the safe spaces were also very dangerous and daring. And like the hedgerows where we could, our Gaelic was continued to be spoken, that safe spaces. And then I think the safe spaces in the churches. There are some churches that were civil rights that are now doing with immigrants. Some churches are a little different than infantizing their congregation. So I wanted to add all that.
Well, that's a whole cornucopia of topics. It's just brilliant, right? There's so much to talk about. Where to begin? I mean, he talks a little bit in the second page of Soul and Market, which is just two huge paragraphs in the second page. But the second paragraph, he talks about the way we have this. He implicitly talks about the way we have this abstract notion of what it means to be a modern citizen. This kind of empty, vacuous abstraction that says this is how moderns should be, right? We're all endowed by our creator with certain inalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. All men are created equal. We have these formulae that say enlightened self-interest, right? Or another one is the rational man, right? Or the reasonable man is another one used in law. So we have all of these abstractions, and together they sort of sketch in this picture of who we're supposed to be in the modern world. And we then do something which is weirdly similar to what the medievalists did when they were negotiating how many angels could dance on the head of a pin. And that is, from those irreal starting points, we then attempt to make systems of laws and culture that would satisfy such an abstract person. And our problem is that no such abstract person exists. None of us are actually that guy, right? We're all actual people who have actual characters and actual cultures that are driving us in certain directions. And as a result, all of these systems that have been designed for that other supposedly perfect abstract person don't really fit us very well. They don't fit anybody really well. And in that second paragraph, he tries to talk about this, and he says, the Banausic is not thinkable to them, to moderns. And what he means is the specific kinds of distortions and warpages that the Banausic worldview imposes upon the world are not conceivable to modern people, because modern people don't recognize that there is a separate character type that's driven by a specific mental faculty and a mode of character that develops out of it. That's unthinkable in the modern world because we're all equal. There can't be a caste of people who think differently than we do and look at laws and conversations and everything differently than we do, but all the same more or less as each other, that are acting as a motive force pushing on society. But this is unthinkable in the modern framework. And so he says, and I quote, behind the facade of a bourgeois reinforcing, mechanistic, or extrinsicalized world order, there still function, in fact, but covertly, the diverse insight strategies and conflicting perspectival needs or preconceptions of different character types, douloi, banausoi, aristoi. He says, we have basically three different approaches to civilization, all occurring at the same time inside of this civilization, all three imagining that they are this abstract rational man that they've been taught since school. Well, in fact, none of them is that. And they are something else that isn't taught. And that the differences they have from each other aren't just some random assortment of, we're all individual snowflakes kind of things, but are actually lawful, driven by their character. So these ideas that we are out of sync with who we really are, and that we are pushing agendas based on who we think we are, in part, but in fact, based on who we actually are that we don't understand even ourselves, creates an enormous muddle for us. The modern world, he's saying in this paragraph, the modern world is profoundly muddled because it isn't as simple as ignorance. It isn't just that it doesn't know itself, but that specifically it knows itself to be something that it isn't. It is sure it is this other thing that doesn't exist. It doesn't know it doesn't exist. It thinks it's that, while in fact it's something else. It says that is a double level of confusion. You're doubly far from the truth, right? You're sure the thing that you're sure is like far away from the truth, and all of these things you desperately need to know about yourself and why you do things in the world are invisible to you and unexpressible and unthinkable. You don't have any language for them. There's no way to even think them. And so all of that kind of, it adds complications to trying to come up with a simple answer to your questions, right? And it's especially true if we then apply the Hegelian dialectic, as Kenneth means us to do, to these three character types, where they grow out of each other. Because it means that when we talk about infantilization, in truth, no adult doulos is the same as the begriff state that we are all born into. None of us actually exists as an adult in that live wire, keyed up, tuned up state, where we grow out of that. Otherwise, we'd still be pooping ourselves and hitting ourselves in the face with our hands and wondering who's doing that, right? We've come a long way. Even the most, as Kenneth would say, the most benighted doulos in the world is still far and away different from the immediate live wire of an infant. But they are still using the infantile motivations to organize all of the Banausic things, all the Verstand things they've learned. It's the master over them all. The only reason that they learn to calculate and to think and to plan rationally is to satisfy their appetites and make themselves feel good. And that's what makes them a doulos. Likewise, the Banausos, part of what Hegel and Smith do that's interesting is that even though Verstand has to be developed out of Begriff, even though the Banausic personality emerges out of the Dualic, nevertheless, the argument that Hegel and Smith both make is that these represent the two core mental faculties, and as a result, they make up the basal metabolism of the mind, and that it is the purpose of culture to make it possible for anyone who can to grow beyond that into the adult mind, the third mind, the Vernunft, mind that's capable of harnessing both gnosis and noesis and using them to align us with the things that matter in the world, which is a tricky business, which is very difficult to pull off. But that's what, you know, adulthood is supposed to be in us as human beings. And that's what modernism suppresses the development of in order to make society more predictable and controllable. Because the one advantage that Douloi and Banausoi have over Aristoi is that they're predictable. If you know a Banausos's systems of thought and organization that it's loyal to, you know what it'll do, roughly. And if you know what a Doulos cares about, how they feel, what their powerful emotional motivations are, then you can control them too, as the market does, right? Constantly manipulating people by how they feel. So the reason that he calls these two modes infantile is that they are both so easy to manipulate. They're both so clueless about themselves. They're clueless about the larger picture. They can't even imagine what an Aristos does or the kind of thought that is. They can only try to translate that into their own modes of thought, and it doesn't fit there because their modes of thought are finitizing, and Vernunft is by definition infinitizing. So this is the thing, infantilization, right? This is one of the questions that you raise. Is like, if a culture is designed in such a way that you can get sociopaths and psychopaths and borderline personality disorder people, and basically, you know, Banausoi, or even Dulic tyrants like Trump, to get on top of it. If it's possible for them to suborn the system and get in charge, then it's not a real culture. It's some form of dysculture. Dyscultures, an example of one of the of a way in which a culture like ours is a dysculture is that from the very beginning, our founding fathers said that what they wanted to create was a system of laws, not men. They said systems of men are too corruptible because men are corruptible. We can't anymore trust in a king or any kind of lord. What we need is a rationalized system that prevents those people from getting in charge. And so they created systems out of the belief that systems can't be subordinated. But in fact, systems are easier to subordinate than people are, because systems follow rules, right? People may or may not follow rules. You may or may not be able to figure out how to corrupt somebody, but you can always figure out how to corrupt a system, like Gödel proved. Every system is corrupt. Every system's corrupt out of the gate. It already doesn't do half the things it claims it does, and it does other things that it claims it doesn't do. They're all systems of levers and buttons and pulleys waiting to be manipulated by somebody who has a manipulative mind, i.e., someone who does Verstand. First Verstand person to come along with, you know, two clues to rub together can look at a system and go, well, here's how I'd corrupt that. You know, it's like, I should be in charge, right? So any system of organization that lends itself to that sort of manipulation is a system in which one of the two infantile modes of thought is being allowed to displace the adult mode of thought. And without the adult mode of thought being involved in thinking through the long-term strategies of things, we're all screwed. Everything becomes a con game. How can this Verstand personality get what he wants in life at the expense of everybody else? It's a con game when people do that, when greed is allowed to be the decision maker. So this is what he means. And our problem is that as moderns, we have been taught from birth, right? From the moment we could talk, from the moment we could think and express ourselves, we've been taught there is no alternative to systematized schemas of culture. It's that or nothing. It's that or chaos. It's that or primitivism. It's that or oh my God, a society of men, not laws. It would all fall apart. We'd all die, right? It's like, this was the thing we fought against. This was the revolution that modernism had against everything that came before. No more systems made up of human beings. They can only be made up of laws. That's how we'll do culture. And so for us, any alternative to modernism is simply unthinkable. Even when we are trying to find a way out of the trap we're in, we look for solutions that resemble the trap we're in, because we don't think it's possible for anything to exist that doesn't have the same structure that was defined for us as the sum total of possibilities. This is why we keep coming back to these simple, seemingly simple metaphors, like Daedalus being the architect of the labyrinth that he's then trapped in. It's like, well, it seems like a simple problem, right? Just don't make a labyrinth. just don't do that, right? But our problem is that by the time we can think that thought, we've already built our labyrinth. Like we're completely surrounded by preconceptions about human nature and culture and world and history that have ruled out for us the things that we most desperately need in order to escape the trap we're in. We know escape is impossible. So we just fiddle around looking for subtly different versions of the same trap, hoping that, somehow it will count as an escape. And we can't see that that's what we're doing because we can't see the frame of our mind. We can only see the contents. We don't realize how it's framed. So I know that's a long-winded answer, and it doesn't actually answer all the things that you raised. I'm really just trying to, highlight what you raised and say, yeah, you, that's the stuff. That's the material that Ken is spending his entire career wrestling with is, these are very thorny problems. These are very thorny problems. But the key to getting out is understanding that it is a labyrinth and that what we've been taught to do in a two-dimensional labyrinth is to look at every possible thing that could be thought as a two-dimensional thing so that it will stay inside the labyrinth. And the idea that we could turn our head in an unaccustomed direction and look up in a third dimension, and the labyrinth is open to the sky. But we've learned that that's not a direction you can go in, so we don't even try. And so the finish of Daedalus's story is he gets out by making wings and flying away in a dimension that the labyrinth wasn't designed around. And in the same way, the solution to our modernist problems are going to be in a direction that we don't even conceive of. It's not that we think that it's wrong, it's that we literally can't think it, whatever it is. And that's where we have to be looking for. That's why hunting around the edges and boundaries of how we think is such a productive thing, because we might stumble upon the third dimension. And once we do, we'll realize it's everywhere. There's a third dimension to everything in a labyrinth. No matter where you go in the labyrinth, there's always an up and a down, right? There's always another way to go. But the whole time we've been training ourselves not to look that way. And it's the first day that we do and understand that that's what we're doing, we open the key to changing everything that we think and everything that we do. Because it's an infinitizing, the third dimension is infinitizing. It's infinitely vast. It's not like one more fact, like one more turn into labyrinth would be. Anyway, that's some stuff.
That's hot stuff. I'll wait my turn, then I'll.
So yeah, I was so busy yapping, I didn't see what order people came
on. Donald, then me, then Phil.
Okay, let's do that. Go ahead, Donald.
It's not the labyrinth, it's the Library of Babylon or whatever that thing is from Borges.
Oh, thank you. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Infinite in every direction. You can't get out. You want to have these dreams, go right ahead. Another thing, when you were using little things about the founding of the U.S., I wanted to throw in one that I like especially is consent of the governed.
Oh, yes, thank you.
That is one. And then I don't know at what point in my long non-apolitical career, all the polls indicated that the people had in fact withdrawn their consent. But I have never seen the government fall. Apparently withdrawing the consent doesn't mean what we think it means. It means something else. And somewhat, since this essay is so much on the summing up, sort of a summing up of the attack on modernity, or not attack. It's not, it's critique or observations. I think when Kenneth was on Contra Kant, he mentioned a book that covers a lot of the same kind of ground. It's by a Polish philosopher, and it's Leszek. In English, it would be Kolakowski, I guess, or Kowski. But this L, in one of his books, in the preface, there's actually something on how you pronounce this. And that L has the little slash that means it's Kowa. And this W is a V, Kovakovsky. But it's modernity on English, on endless trial. And I think Kenneth actually mentioned this book when he was talking in Contra Kant. But maybe it's the same kind of thing only, but maybe for some more accessible. Because I'll just say Kolakowski is Polish. He is a Marxist, or kind of, I don't know. There's no point in putting him in a box, but he certainly knows Marx. And he certainly understands Marx's critique of modernity, and many of his critiques, as he puts modernity on trial, are Marxist in nature. He also has the great benefit of having grown up in a country governed by professional Marxists. And he's seen the other end of, I don't know what it is, it's like Darth Maul with the two-ended lightsaber.
Right.
You're impressed by the critique, but the solutions are often not what you desire.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's a very, very look, I've read this. Kenneth, I know, has read it because we've discussed it. And he did mention it. And I find I've got lots of things by this Polish fella. He's dead now. You can actually read all of him if you work hard enough, because there'll be no more new stuff. I mean, when you try and sum up a living author, it does no good.
He's not done yet.
They're not done yet. Count no man happy before he's dead.
Yeah, there's that archaic Greek idea. Yes.
So
well, I think one of his books that we might know the title of is "Why Is There Something Rather Than Nothing?"
Yes,
he's the one who wrote that.
Why is God happy?
Yes.
And, he's got all kinds of, and they're really deep, profound, but accessible things. Why
That's a
is there
brilliant
something?
combo.
I bought Why Is There Something Rather Than Nothing, and read it because I thought, gosh, he's finally going to make Heidegger clear to me.
I can't help but notice from the bibliography on the Wikipedia article, which I'll post a link to right now, that he has a book called Bergson.
Oh,
It does?
That brings us full circle, doesn't it?
Yes.
I don't think I have that. I have half a dozen or so of his books. Every one of them is a delightful read. They're usually like short chapters. He's fairly witty. He gets right to the crux of the point, which is, and he has a really different perspective, having grown up in Eastern Europe somewhat. He's not, I don't know what you'd say. Well, he's not sentimental about the church. I don't think.
What also not sentimental is about communism.
Yeah, he's not. Yeah, he's
not
like,
a fan of either one.
right. So they're very good books, and they present very, very similar critiques to Kenneth, although coming at it from a different angle. And the same thing. Just think about this, and it'll change you, which is what philosophy. That's kind of one of the paradoxes. I always thought in my study of Plato that it was very unclear whether teaching can ever occur, but learning can. But one has to do that for oneself. And there's a certain questioning or showing juxtapositions of things that put the student in the frame of mind to experience learning.
Yes.
And again, I'm not gonna make.
Yeah. This time you didn't even have to say the words, and we all heard you thinking them. It's like that's enough of that. So before I call on Sharon and Phil, I'd just like to point out, that it is something that frequently bedevils centrists and the right, that they always want to lump the left into one big group that loves communism. And the classic example of the critique of communism as being neither better nor worse, but just more of the same with a different hat compared to capitalism is Noam Chomsky, who, let me just say, in the 60s and 70s and 80s, an enormous number of left-wing pro-commie, pro-socialist groups, and I speak from experience because I grew up in those environments. They hated him. They hated Chomsky because Chomsky said, the Soviet Union isn't any better than the United States. They're just two different modernist ways of getting everybody trapped, either through their duped consent or through coercion. But in both cases, they commit ecocide, they commit genocide, they're warmongering. They go through the list of abstractions, and they have them all in common. They just change out, who's calling the shots. But other than that, they do everything pretty much the same. So Chomsky said they're both a problem.
They're both based on materialism.
They're both, yes. That was his critique. So, with the position that Kolakowski here is when you say, he grew up under communism, so it means that he's not delighted by communism. He's not suckered by it. It's like there always was this other strand of political critique that refused to take one side or the other in the capitalism versus communism Cold War, but that said, a pox on both your houses, you both suck. Now, none of these things is a viable solution. We need something better than either of them.
Always go back to Arendt, The Origins of Totalitarianism, the single most innovative contribution to political science of the 20th century. And we got it in spades.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's everybody. If only we could make that guy over there do what we want him to do.
All would be well.
All would be well.
That's right.
And you hear that in the United States. You hear it. You hear it among every politician. That's what they offer. We're going to make them do what you want them to do.
Yes.
And
that always ends well, right? All right, Sharon and then Phil. Go ahead, Sharon.
Oh, I like that quote of Kenneth Smith. And this is just a sidebar here where it says, every other subject just gives you something new to think about when the philosophy gives you something to think with. I like Kenneth Smith's approach because what it has allowed me to do as somebody who's struggled with philosophy for years is to engage. Because the diversity and questioning of his presentations really catches my attention. Right? And so I like that very much. And that's why I like him. Now, I want to follow up on what you were saying, Rick, because this brings me back to a pet idea of mine that says man is basically evil, struggle is to be good. And while I am sitting here, I am thinking about a book that I read, or that I saw my son reading when he was doing political science, called The Leviathan by, I think it was Hobbes. And I remember we had a discussion about establishment of social theory. And if I remember from when Jason was in college, we had to talk about that concept, right? That, and I think Leviathan also was mentioned in the book of Job, really, really, really far back. But I think we struggle, and this would be an everlasting struggle to overcome a nature of ours that is not good. And then the third thing I want to bring up is this sentence here that's in the essay where it says, the market is not at all a self-functioning mechanism, but can be played to the advantage of those at the top or those all up and down the hierarchy, understand more of the techni of the market and its actual functioning than their fellows do. And I think you can extrapolate this to other entities in society. The pandemic, and I was listening to an issue on climate change today, and the countries that produce the most carbon dioxide in the United States are not the ones that have the most egregious damage or suffer the most from it. The little countries where you have these coastal towns with poor people, and you have all these people migrating. Why? Because their farms are becoming non-functional, either from drought or from flooding. So it's the same concept. So that one sentence encapsulates what we're seeing today. I don't know if I'm reading that right.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. This is really close to the core topic I wanted to talk about today about this chapter, soul and market. The idea is that it's to go back to why do we keep bringing Hegel into this? What does Hegel have to do with this? His critique of abstraction, as to abstract is to be an error. That the power of universality that we gain by leaving behind Begriff and going to Verstand comes at the price of losing all the nutritious details of Begriff and replacing them with these vacuous abstractions in Verstand. And that merely by that foreground background action of suppressing all the richness of life and replacing it with schemas and calculations, we find ourselves in a position where anything becomes possible. Literally any horrible thing, not just the good things that we all promise each other when we launch into these schemas, but I think any horrible thing becomes possible too, because we've erased all the details that make it possible to stay focused on the good things in life, on the things that matter, on taking care of each other, on having a sustainable regenerative relationship to nature, on anything you can put on the list. It turns out, like Kant implicitly acknowledged without ever recognizing what he was acknowledging, all of the basis for right and wrong count as non-rational and therefore get suppressed away, just like he did between the first and second editions of his Critique of Pure Reason. Right? He goes through and he says, this thing there shouldn't be anything traditional or religious or historical or emotional or otherwise unconscious or irrational. The second edition will be 100% rational. And in order to do that, he suppresses all of the bases for deciding what's right and wrong. And he thinks that he hasn't done that, but it's what he's done. And it leaves us in this position where we believe, and this is, I'll come back to this part, where we believe that what we've created is a pure, clean, rational, logical, good system, when what we've actually done is to create a system that doesn't know right from wrong, but that is going to amass enormous amounts of power, so that whenever it makes a mistake, they're not going to be little mistakes anymore. They're going to be gigantic, worldwide, systematized industrial mistakes at a scale that it's very hard to compensate for. What we've maximized is not actually the rationality of the system, or not rationality in the sense of goodness, but rationality in the sense of power. And power makes stupid, says Nietzsche. Power corrupts. Power means you trip and stumble, and next thing you know, you've just eradicated a species because you're too big, you're too powerful. Your mistakes aren't human scale anymore. So in this paragraph, he's talking about the way, especially from the opening couple of words of that sentence, he's talking about the way we are taught that the market has an invisible hand that guides it toward ultimate. It may make mistakes in the short run, but in the long run, it will do the right thing. It's self-correcting, right? This is the same language we use about the US government. We say the three branches of government balance each other, and therefore it's not possible for it to go berserk, right? It's self-correcting. This is the dogma of modernism, and we'll apply it to anything modern that we make. It's a rational, because we believe deep down that all rational systems are self-correcting systems. And in this, we're like half right. It's true that all rational systems turn back in on themselves, but not out of rationality, but out of limiting what they're able to understand. They turn away from the infinite and back to the finite, and they mistake that turning back for some kind of self-correction, when what it really is a self-editing to make sure that they can't see the infinite, that the infinite has been disappeared from the picture, and what we're left with are facts and details and lines of reasoning that all add up. Nice little columns and rows and a little total button at the bottom. And I say this not as somebody who hates spreadsheets. I do it for a living. I'm the executive director of my nonprofit. I spend my life in spreadsheets. But spreadsheets all lie, right? Because they're abstract. They make sense. They're coherent for the parts that they're willing to acknowledge as real, but they suppress from their reality most of the things that matter. And so we find ourselves left without ethical considerations in the market, but what we find ourselves with plenty is what he calls techni here.
Yes.
And techni are the kinds of pieces of knowledge that allow you to do things. Now, they don't allow you to make a value judgment and decide right from wrong, but they do they increase your power. They're know-how. And it's part of the reason why Verstand and Benausoy as fields don't just include money managers and traders and bankers and insurance agents. It also includes engineers and doctors and anybody who does a technical job for a living. If you do a technical job for a living that requires learning an enormous amount of information that has to be coordinated systematically in order to succeed, then you're doing Verstand. This is what I do all day. I do Verstand. Medicine in its modern form wouldn't be possible without massive amounts of Verstand. And engineering is Verstand personified. And what we do when we do accounting and banking and insurance adjusting and all those other things with spreadsheets is just an abstract form of what the rest of us are doing who have technical fields. It's all Verstand. And so that's the import of his sentence here. You know, if the system is, if the structures of the hierarchies of the market are driven by technical know-how, then the market is not equal. It's not a place where the best ideas rise. It's a place where whoever knows the levers and buttons to push to manipulate the market rises. The techni that are about the market itself, the metatechni, right? And the import of this, which was the thing that I most wanted to talk about, and I'll just introduce it here, but then I'll call on Phil and Marianne, is this idea that the difference between the meritocracy that we imagine the market to be and the actual machinery of levers and buttons that it truly is what traps us in our circumstances. And it's what makes us victims of the most sociopathic people who figure out how to manipulate that market, because it means that the whole thing that we thought was based on trust and merit is actually an elaborate con game. It is as though your home didn't exist anymore and you were born and raised and lived inside of a big con game. And all around you were people who, most of whom believed that they were at home, but a few of which knew none of us are at home and this is the carny and we're here to con you. And those people get away with whatever they want because the rest of us don't even understand the game that we're playing. We think we're just going about our lives. And the whole time we're getting set up for con after con after con in order to maximize return on investment for the people who have that technical knowledge about how to manipulate the market. This is the import of this sentence that Sharon's drawing out here. From Hegel all the way to Carney's, all the way to our circumstance, to the modern world and its structure. It's just one elaborate con game that most people mistake for life. That's what he's saying. So Phil and then Marianne and then Joseph. Go ahead, Phil.
Yeah, while I agree with all of this, I must say that I also disagree in a sense. Because
before you go on,
always,
I love that about you, Phil.
Yes.
because systems has always been a part of civilization. It is true that modernity has abstracted it even further. I'll admit that. But this goes all the way back to Babylon, certainly to Greece, abstraction in Greece, and even to Egypt, which is the measurements. I think it really goes back to the infinite and the finite in this sense, right? And the question about why is there something rather than nothing, I cannot answer that metaphysical question, but I think I could sort of answer the epistemological question, is that with nothing, you can't think about the something. So therefore, I think man is trapped in the sense that he's eaten the apple, metaphorically, and he knows, and he pretends that knowing is unlimited, but in fact is only a limitation of the everything, or even the nothing, So therefore, in a sense, I think early on civilization had made an effort to deal with the something that we know. And what is problematic is not the something that we know, but the fact that it consolidates and hardens into a system that you cannot escape from without a kind of overturning in a kind of civilization. We could think of Christianity as a thing. We could think about feudalism was sort of gathered together, so you have an aristocracy that, in a sense, reduced the power of the nobility, so that it's easier in a way to displace it with another system, which is the middle class and the marketing structure. And that's why I asked a number of times, I don't know whether in this meeting or some other meetings, like how many people from the Bastille that also fermented the French Revolution was in the oath of the tennis court. They were excluded from the very beginning.
Right.
So it's only one system placing another system. So in a sense, I would even go back to pre-civilization. The moment we discover the flint tools, we have made a decision that creating a kind of advantage for a civilization to develop, in a sense, it's a trade-off we made. So there was, I wouldn't call it an original sin because that sounds too biblical, but I think that was, in a way, our destiny. And I wish we had figured out a way to create civilization without forgetting the world that we live in and the wonderment about the otherness that exists that we cannot understand. So I think it's putting too much of a burden on modernity. Modernity is just even a further hardening of what we've begun. It was evolution itself of modernity that created this inescapable structure, because we wanted to understand, and to understand at some point becomes specialization, becomes technical. And so therefore, in a sense, none of us could even understand the unlimited information in the knowable universe, let alone the unknowable universe.
Right.
I remember when my nephew was very young, maybe 5 or so, he would wake up. I would come in and he said, it's so exciting to wake up because like everything's so fresh. The day is reborn. I said, oh my gosh, how wonderful you are. I just hope you never lose that. Of course, as adults, we all, in a sense, lose that to a certain degree because we have responsibility to the civilization that we're bound to live in. So therefore, we cannot just blame civilization. It is like the inevitable evolution of our species. And I think we need to, in a sense, backtrack somewhat and begin to recognize the otherness, which we are beginning to understand a little bit more, and also never forget about the awesomeness of the unexplainable, despite the fact that we have to live in the city. And that's why I always bring up the metaphor of equivocation. You have to be in the city, but you also always have to look outside and wonder at the infinity that exists beyond. So I think we're being too harsh, and not that it doesn't deserve the criticism, but if you're going to criticize, then you have to criticize civilization all the way back.
That's right.
The way back. This is
That's
our
right.
burden that we live with.
Yeah. Yeah. Modernism was not born ex nihilo, right? It's
Mhm.
building on things. You're right. It's expanding things. And, you know, it's tricky because what we really want to do is raise the level of criticism of modernism to the same level that modernism praises itself, so
Mhm.
that they'll be in balance.
Yeah.
But the problem is nobody's ever praised themselves as much as moderns do, because we think the past was just a primitive, bad version of ourselves. We think we're the most objective, the truest, the goodest, the most advanced. We're like, there's no superlative that we don't heap on ourselves and say, well, we're free now, unlike those people in the past. And so as a result, in order to balance that with criticism at the same level, it comes over the top. It's like, well, let's bring you down to size. I'm going to have to dig through an awful lot of self-praise before we get to the level of having matched it with criticism. And it sounds mean and cruel and harsh, but part of the way that it works is in our everyday lives, we look around ourselves and hey, I have running water. Furthermore, I can have warm running water. I read a critique one time that said, an awful lot of what makes modern civilization good can be summed up with warm running water. Clean, warm running water. And we take it for granted because we're looking at airplanes and rockets and all of this really exciting stuff. But the revolution in life that's possible when you have all the warm water or cold water that you need and you never run out effectively.
But it's also good to recognize that the era of decolonialization, in
Yes.
which we at least permit other voices to
Yes.
seep through, is
Yes.
important, because
Yes.
like if that haven't broken through, the otherness will remain silent and like I said, invisible. The fact that they have, either because they have forced their way in to
Yes.
being heard, or else we finally have arrived at a point where permitting at least some of that to seep in, I think is a good move that we allow ourselves to have, because to shut off the other voices that could criticize or offer another view, I think that's important. And certainly in colonialism, and I include colonialism as like capitalism, is in some sense, in a sense, to shut those people up. And now at least they are forcing their way in to the discussion.
And thank goodness.
It as quiet as it is right at the moment.
So I love that you live at the city gate where you can see both inside and outside, and I love that you stand up for Oedipus. I love that you seek balance in these discussions. It's a beautiful thing, man. So I know Sharon was the most recently added to the line, but I can't remember whether it was Marianne or Joseph
Marianne.
first. Okay, Marianne then. Thank you.
I also like that it goes back to the days of the Flint, because I want to go into what's happening right now. And I feel really upset because the high-tech people are trying to get under my skin, get all my data. They want to make my consciousness, me so unconscious that I can be easily polarized and vote for this or that. I am upset that they say, don't ask permission, ask for forgiveness. The ethics is not there. It's just all abstracted into mathematics. And it was like a gold rush into my subconscious.
It's true. They want all your data. They want your entire unconscious. They want it all. if there's any part of you that authentically belongs to you and isn't a resource to be exploited by the market, these people believe that it's a horrific wasted opportunity. It's just squandered potential profits. Anything about you that they don't know is a direct threat to their ability to beat their competition at profit. So you're right, Marianne. That's what they want. They want it all. Whatever you've got. Kenneth Smith used to say, if there's even one greasy nickel left in your pocket, somewhere in the world, some accountant is kept up late at night because he can't sleep worrying about why he doesn't have that nickel yet. How's he going to get it from you?
I was watching a movie about Billie Holiday. I can't remember.
Holiday.
Holly, yeah. And she was saying, take all of me. Why not take all of me? And I understood that as an abused woman. When you are an abused woman, that's how it feels. You are that. So I had to add that.
Thank you, Marianne. Joseph, go ahead.
I'll just make a quick comment. That accountant calls the engineer to figure out how to actually get the rest of that.
Right? We know what our job is.
I'm just gonna say, we keep coming back to, the core of the problem. Now there's this idea of, I'm just jealous of engineers, all right, because it's really hard. Differential equations is really hard. So this is me acting out. Okay. So
you're killing me, man.
It really is. I'm making it the root of all the evils. So, but I am trying to figure out, if we have these two systems, and I'm building on with what Phil had said, that it's not just modernity that's created this problem of, modern economics, or, we talk about knowing what buttons to push, whether it be a capitalistic system or whether it be even a communistic system. Right. So, I mean, what I'm trying to get at is what is the ideal type of system? Because I'm seeing the abstractions as problems, right? The idea of money is kind of a problematic. It's an abstraction, so that we're drawn from what is actually being done, and then therefore we act in different ways. Even Marianne had just mentioned the idea of how our data and our personal information is being is an abstraction, basically is a way of means of control. So then what is the best approach to a market?
Society.
To society. So what are we getting at? Because we've critiqued the two dominant. You can say we really. It's hard to say what socialism is, because Bernie Sanders said it correctly during the debate. He says America is socialist. It's just socialist for corporations. So that's true. So there's even socialism that's like kind of whether we're a market or whatever we are. So what are we getting at? What is the ideal system and approach that would actually be Kenneth's answer to this problem? And part of the problem is these abstractions, I understand, it makes it a lot more problematic because we don't see what we're actually doing and we're not touching what we're doing. I absolutely see that. And modern monetarism, like basically the way we use money, and that is problematic. The way we manipulate currencies, and every country does it. So I'm asking, what's the answer to the question? Like,
you know what I'm gonna say, right?
As long as an engineer doesn't have it, I don't care. I'm hoping a philosopher has it. Okay.
Well, of course, the problem is that if we fully understood what's wrong with what we're doing now, we could just start doing the thing we should be doing. It's the reason that we can't do the thing we should be doing is that that we have no practice with that. We have no experience with it. We have no context for understanding it. We have no language for it. We have no models or terminology for it. All of our models and terminology are for what we're doing now. And so any attempt to describe, and I'm going to use Phil's terminology of the other here, that alien other system, that whatever, if it's even a system at all, let's say that alien other culture that would allow us to live in a better way from within the context of this one is going to be like the guy in the labyrinth looking for another two-dimensional solution to the problem. Our language is wrong. Our concepts are wrong. Our models are wrong. Our experience is wrong. We're beautifully optimized to be incompetent to answer the question you've asked. And part of this is part of why Kenneth's focus, he gets asked that question a lot, and he always grins because he's like, yeah, I'm not going to tell you the answer because nobody in this room, including myself, could possibly know what the answer is. If there were ever people in the history of the world, we're most perfectly suited to not answer the question. We've been so cultivated to always express our solutions in terms of what we already know. And what we know claims more than any system previously to see everything objectively the way it really is. And so that makes it even harder for us to look beyond the frame that we were taught in. Because whatever we may consciously teach ourselves through philosophy, all kinds of constellations of emotions and ideas in our unconscious, they know that we are the best of all possible worlds and we're the pinnacle of history. And the reason we can rattle all these phrases off is we've got them memorized and they go all the way down. Those roots go all the way down into the soil. So the only way to find a way out is going to be not systematically, not by design, not through conscious choice of the ego, but rather through the processes of the philosophy of science, where we re-engage with the world in ways to give us new perspectives on what we're doing, to see the things about what we're doing that we currently can't see, so that we start to notice when there are examples of other cultures that didn't do it that way. Because only then are we going to be able to understand them, not as a primitive version of ourselves, but as an alternative to ourselves. Because then we'll see the meat of the alternative. We'll say that's weird because all modern cultures do X. And yet, for all the ways in which the Etruscans were like us, in this way, they totally didn't do what we do. None of them did it. They all did this other thing, and somehow it worked for them. You know, we got to get to the point where we can see specific, tangible differences like that that force us to ask meaningful, meaty questions. And this is one of the reasons that I spend a lot of time thinking about slave versus non-slave societies and indigenous versus colonizer societies, because those are two of the pillars of modernism, slavery and colonization. So by studying indigenous cultures, it's a way to sort of slap myself in the face and make myself jar loose, at least momentarily, from the frame of a colonizer culture like the one I'm in, and say, you mean that could be different? This X or Y or Z could be different? Because you see the indigenous cultures not doing whatever that is, and it starts to clue you in that what you thought was a inevitable, inescapable feature might actually just be an option, and there might be another way to go. So how do I say this?
Well,
I'll give you a
that was beautifully put. I mean, it gave me a really interesting perspective as to what colonizer cultures actually do, is they limit the alternatives to what we can actually even see. They limit our frames of reference.
right.
So I'm starting to see that now everything's kind of coming together because it's only this perspective or this perspective.
Right.
And we're seeing this actually go on throughout the world right now to a certain extent.
So the way to show the flip side of my answer, the hopeful side instead of the difficult side, is as follows. No totalitarianizing system of ideas or worldviews is as totalitarianizing as it wishes it were. So there are many survivors, for example, of the residential school system, many indigenous people who, despite all the efforts of the United States and Canada and other colonizer countries, they didn't lose everything. And they're going through a renaissance all over these continents now, and in Australia and other places that have been colonized. where they are taking the pieces of what they didn't forget and putting it together with the evidence that got saved. And in the words of my Navajo friends, they say it's not that they're trying to recreate a museum replica of who they were, because they're not living 500 years ago. They can't be those people, and they shouldn't be those people. But rather, they're trying to rediscover the principles. And this is where we get at Vernunft instead of Verstand and Begriff. What were the generative principles that unfolded into those cultures? Because if they can rediscover those principles and get them working again in their own culture, then they don't have to know where they're going. They will be going the right way, and they'll discover along the way who it is that they're becoming as they become indigenous in a renewed way. And a non-indigenous example of that, the one that I'm most familiar with at my entire, so far 37 years and counting, my whole career is in medical software. And so this example is near and dear to my heart. This one I'm about to give. It goes like this. Most medical software is crap. I mean, it's really, really bad. Most of your medical data is being kept in systems that are jury-rigged and cobbled together, and were never designed to do what they're doing today. Most of these systems were designed to be billing and scheduling systems. They wanted your money. So they're very good at spreadsheets. They were very good at figuring out what you owe and whether you have insurance. And they bolted onto that framework little modules to say, well, I guess I should collect some demographic. Wouldn't it be nice if I knew the name of the guy I'm billing? I suppose it's worth keeping track of his name. Oh, I suppose I need to know this. I suppose they sort of bolt on these additional fields to the database. But the database was still focused on, give me your money. That was the center of the thing. And when are you coming in, and how do I organize my people? So there are only a handful of medical systems in the whole world that weren't built that way. All these cobbled together systems were designed. They were designed, and the problem with designing things, trying to be God, and you lay out your little table, and you start drawing your drawings, and you lay out your master design, is that nobody understands complicated problems as well as they think they do. When you try to design ex nihilo through a divine exercise of ego, you always make a mess. You always create a disaster. You're always leaving out enormous numbers of things that you should have included, and including things you should have left out. And so what happens after that is your design is so rigid and so self-internally consistent and repellent to other ideas that other things have to be bolted on in a Frankensteinian way, because it's the only way to get them into a design that was always hostile to change. It was always designed to be right the first time. And because it wasn't right the first time, the changes to it had to be wedged in. Things had to be broken and shifted, and you end up with a Frankenstein. The vast majority of medical software in the world are these Frankensteinian systems that were designed, and then they've attempted to patch them by ramming things into them that don't go there. And that's why in so many hospitals, you have to actually carry a piece of paper with you when you go from one department to another, because they don't have the systems talking very well together, because they weren't ever actually designed together. And they might not have been part of the original design to begin with. So the problem in all these schemas is creation through design. Now, to a modern, creation through design is how all creation happens. We can't imagine creation that isn't through design. Design is how you do things. How could there be an alternative to creation through design? Well, I'll tell you, not every medical system in the world was built this way. The system used by the US Department of Veterans Affairs was not written by computer programmers. It was built by doctors and nurses and lab techs and pharmacists. And they built it piece by piece over time. And they had to talk to each other and share things because none of them knew the whole picture. So it was never designed, first of all. Second of all, since it could only be done a little bit at a time, it had to be built incrementally so that new features would unfold out of the existing features for version after version after version, in a very different way than happens with the design system. From the ground up, the Vista system is designed to be moldable and changeable and adaptable. The whole focus of the system is not any design, but is on how do I change in the next version from the version I have now. It's this constant unfolding is the point, which is exactly the case with embryogenesis.
Right.
That's how a human being comes into existence, is not through a design, but through a whole series of stages of unfolding, none of which knows where it's going. Mm-hmm. but all of which are keenly sensitive to and listening to their immediate circumstances, including the hormone baths that the mother's womb is subjecting them to in stages. And that causes them to unfold in different ways at different times in different parts of the body until you get a human being. You couldn't design a person. You couldn't design a tree. You couldn't design,
Right.
even a single cell couldn't be designed. But it can be unfolded by being just very sensitive, very aware, and constantly reinventing itself. Now, we know that this works because, as of, I don't know, 10 years ago, the VA hospitals had changed from being some of the worst hospitals in America to being consistently in the top 60 to 70% ranked by JACO of hospital quality and hospital care. And the way they did that was through their VISTA systems. They did that by being able to manage the information, so they weren't giving people drugs that they were allergic to. They weren't causing drug interactions as often. They weren't giving people food they were allergic to. The information was keeping track of the information that in the 70s they were losing, that was causing them to leave people to die in hallways. Now they could keep track of where everybody was. So just by managing the information in a blind way from a design standpoint, but a highly observant way from an immediate reaction standpoint, they were able to back their way into a system no human being could ever have designed.
Right.
So 30, I'm like one of the main teachers, in the world for this system. There's a handful of us who teach it. Most of us just use it or build it, but I'm a teacher and a writer about this stuff. And I could never have designed this thing, even though I can explain it to people. Nobody could have.
Do you teach the methodology?
That's what I teach.
Okay. So that's the most important part, because it seems like it's like actually you're working through nature.
Yes.
This is what essentially that you're talking about. Everything
Yes.
you talk to is coming back to nature, whether it be
Yes.
the colonizer culture upsetting the fact that you're disturbing nature, but also the systemic approach that it upsets nature as well as far as a design perspective.
Yes.
And I'm starting to see how to let things organically grow, which you couldn't possibly have come up with on your own if you're trying to design it with an end in mind. And that's
Exactly.
primarily because we've been perverted by the systems that we are operating in. So therefore we're going to divide, and that gets where you're saying that the spreadsheet is a small abstraction.
Yes.
So that's why the spreadsheet doesn't work. And that's why the bolt-ons don't work.
Right.
Okay. All right. I get
and
it.
So that's how cultures work. A living culture
and the
works
Tao,
exactly that way.
The Tao.
Yeah, that's how the Tao works, right? These things are related. So one of the examples of this at a cultural level is I'm Facebook friends with a number of indigenous people after Standing Rock. I kind of found a lot of people and so that I would hear constantly kind of what their lives are like and how they see things. They said one of the tricks to being an indigenous person is that as you walk around your neighborhood and as you walk around, the yards and the forests and the streams around you, you're looking at everything. You don't spend the whole time chatting about the latest movie. I mean, you can spend some time about that, but there's part of you has to always be watching and listening. And if there's anything that is a part of your environment that you don't understand, like a plant you've never seen before,
right,
you have to find out what it is. Like you have to remember, here's something I don't know. And when you get an opportunity, when you get back home, you can ask your elders, what is this plant that looks like this and behaves like this? But it doesn't end with knowledge. They say you're still not indigenous then, right? But at least you're paying attention. The next step to being indigenous is that the elder not only tells you what it is, but it has some use to you. You have a relationship with that plant. There is some way in which it's essential to your culture and you just don't know yet. And so you have to learn its uses. Is it medicinal? Is it edible? Is it poisonous and you need to learn to avoid it and teach others to avoid it? It's got some relationship to you and you have to work out what that is. And then you have to incorporate that into your life and change your behavior so that it becomes relevant. And it's why so many indigenous costumes are made out of they're made out of local materials. They're made frequently like a medicine bundle that an indigenous person wears around their neck. The things that are in it, they had to go get those things. They can't buy them. Nobody can give it to you. It's like if there's supposed to be a little piece of turquoise and a little piece of, let's say, obsidian and maybe there's supposed to be some pollen from corn and a few other things. You have to go, if you're Navajo, you have to go to the specific mountains where those things are and collect them yourself and put them into your medicine bundle, because that journey to that place is part of being indigenous. Having stood there and listened to it and smelled it and seen it. And not only that, it's not just for decoration, but that it is why you're able to do the things you can do with your medicine bundle. Because of that mountain, all those miles away, it's connected to you in your daily life. Everything that you do, every ceremonial you go into. And so what they're doing is knitting themselves piece by piece, discovery by discovery, generation by generation. They're knitting themselves into the landscape until they become part of it. They and the landscape are inseparable. And that's why the Navajo Hogan is built around the 4 sacred directions, which involve the 4 mountains at the borders of the Navajo territory, which involve things that they collect for all of their rituals, which corresponds to the cycles of a human life, the directions, the colors correspond. Everything is knit together into a whole until one understands why they're indigenous to this place.
Right.
Nobody knows this place as well as they do, and this place knows them better than any other place could know them. And the thing that's telling about this, that the Navajo are so connected to this one place, is that by the Navajo's own origin story, they didn't start out there. They started out far, far away. They had to journey thousands and thousands and thousands of miles to come to this place because they didn't do well in their previous places. They had to leave and move on 4 times before they came to where they are. And their oral culture, they were as far away as the Pacific. Their oral culture might even take them back to Asia. It's hard to know how to interpret some of the oldest of the stories, but they know they weren't here forever. Right? So at first, all the things that seem to define them as a people now weren't part of their culture. But what they did have was that indigenous approach to culture.
Right.
So that when they came to this place, however many centuries or thousands of years ago it was, but in some limited, tangible amount of time, they then indigenized. And they became a people that they couldn't have designed. In exactly the same way that Vista became medical software none of us could have designed. And, appealing to Sharon in this point, right? Science at its best, this is what makes science go, right? That we are constantly rechecking with the world and sensitive to it and letting it teach us things. Teach us things we didn't know, and also teach us things that we did know, but that were wrong. And the world teaches it's wrong, and we have to let it go and replace it with something better. And as long as we do that, we will find our way to something healthier than where we are now, even though we don't know where that is. There's a kind of faith in it, but there's also a kind of experience in it, that we've seen it happen. We know that it will happen if we're just aware enough and sensitive enough to it.
Kind of skepticism too, if you don't understand.
Yes. Yes.
So
anyway, that's my long-winded answer to your short, simple question.
Well, I love it. I love it because I have a couple of comments. First of all,
Thank you.
Comment on the medical. Thank you. Do you have anything to say, Joseph? No. First
No, I was
of all,
just saying
I love
thank you.
your comment on the software, because I've been in the business for a long time, and I'm coming from the school where the software did not even have the intraconnectivity, the software. And then the next thing was the interconnectivity. Now I'm in a different specialty than as an anesthesiologist, where you had a very limited use for the software. In family medicine, it's much different. And so my question to you is, as the paradigm of medicine goes from disease management, which is appointment, billing, etc., goes from disease management to disease prevention, right? The software are going to require different things. And this is where I feel very excited about the use of AI, right? Because you're going to be able to fit all these parameters in your height, your weight, your family, your history, and make an intelligent decision, an aided intelligent decision, possibly about not your disease, but your predisposition. Because you can inherit a disease. You don't have to manifest. you can inhibit that manifestation by your diet and your lifestyle. And that's what I am hoping AI will do for us in the future. But we got to have software that will be able to take the data, churn it, and give us meaningful answers. And I identify with Miriam. I have Google Maps on my phone. And if I go to the gym, by the time I get home, it asks me, well, how was the gym? You know, I can't stand that. They're tracking me. You know? They do. They do. And so you really feel like you're being watched all the time.
You
and
are.
I need it because I cannot find my way around. I cannot find my way around. Now, the third thing I wanted to say, and I'm out there, as we keep talking about, you know, the system, the colonizers. No, the fourth thing I have, the third thing, the colonizer cultures. When the people who are colonized finally are relieved of the colonization, the psychological trauma of that colonization impacts the way they govern. And I think no other country shows that more than South Africa. They were cruel, that they had cruelty bestowed on them when they were colonized, and now that they're the rulers, that's their expression, cruelty. And that's just to put it mildly. So I listened to you with a great interest when you said the indigenous cultures are now able to go back and become indigenous again. How are they going to manage that? What happens to that trauma? Because I see it, you know, colonization. Yeah. That's one of the enduring factors of colonization. And the fourth thing I wanted to talk about, when we talk about societies and their structure, I go back to the nature, because I'm a hiker and I love to be outside. And the lion is the king of the jungle. So look at the way it's structured. The lion is the king of the jungle. And if we're bringing it down to a minute level, look at a beehive. There's the queen bee, the worker bee, and the drones. I think we can call them Hegel's dialectic here, right? And the queen, and you can help me with that. And the queen bee just sits around, and then the drones, they work and work and work and work, and they die. They don't have any information. They're not part of the meritocracy. Only the queen bee is. So when I look at that structure, and I try to extrapolate it to the way we set up our societies, they have designed educational systems to keep us ignorant, to keep us from being able to make good decisions in our lives, to run our lives. Well, some individuals do break through, get good education, and that's what my dad told us. Education is the only thing we know, and education and excellence are the only things that we do. Right? That was the way I was brought up. And so few of us do make it through, but there's this overriding factor to keep you, I hate to say ignorant, but uninformed, so that the aristocracy and the markets can continue to make profit.
Right.
That's all I have to say.
Well, that's beautiful stuff. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, you know, this is kind of why I referred to that sentence out of this essay by Kenneth, where I'm saying that he's calling modernism a con game, because keeping people educated about the wrong things so that they never learn the things that are most important in their lives. They only learn how to do technical things that don't challenge the balance of power, how to do technical things that make them useful to the balance of power. Controlling the balance of what are they informed about and what are they ignorant about is as central to modernism as anything that we think of as modern. You know, if we think high technology is modern, if we think hygiene and modern medicine are modern, if we think, you know, rockets and planes and anything we could put on that list, you know, those are the visible, tangible things. But one of the most important untangible things that makes modernism tick is this withholding of information, but doing it in a way so that people can be highly informed about the things that don't help them to understand the labyrinth, but incredibly uninformed about even the most basic things about the labyrinth itself, until they actually can't see the labyrinth because they don't have any words for it. They don't have any concepts or models for it, and nobody ever taught them about it. And maybe their teachers didn't know either. And that's how it perpetuates itself. There's this, Chomsky talks about this in Manufacturing Consent. He says, what makes a healthy modernist system is that it allows lively debate. People can explore and debate and argue as much as they want and feel completely free and alive, but only within a frame. And they're never allowed to stray outside the frame. Or if they are, they're not going to get published. They're going to lose funding. There's all these subtle things happen to make it hard to operate outside of the frame. But as long as you're in the frame, you can talk all you want. You can argue all you want. You can, you're free, right, in your cage. So there is a way in which, what you were raised with around the focus on education is in some ways the key to the whole thing. So if we can just learn those things that we've been encouraged not to learn and start to see the things that have been kept invisible to us, then we become more free and we become more able to create one of these feedback loops, one of these living organizational feedback loops that makes it possible to indigenize and to become unpatriarchal and to become, not a colonizer culture and not a warfaring culture and so forth. These are things that we can iteratively do when we have access to the information that's been withheld from us, because then we can take it into account. Then we can start trying experiments. Well, what if I do this differently? What if I do that differently? And eventually we hit on the successful strategies. So I'm glad you talked about that.
But the average story keeps you uninformed. Look at the way we construct our textbooks. Because I think one of the things that's central to your core is to know who you are.
Yes.
You know who you are by knowing your history. So when the politicians say that by including slavery in the textbooks is to increase divisiveness, that's just so wrong.
Right. And that's why they're so keep it out.
And when you deny the Holocaust, that's also
so wrong. So wrong.
So it's just it's a methodology.
And Kenneth would say that they are withholding the most important information is the clearest sign that they're not Aristoi. They want to take the place of Aristoi. They want to be in charge, but they don't want to do the things you have to do to actually belong there. It's like when you see somebody imitating what they think an anesthesiologist is like, because they're so desperate to be in charge, but they don't actually know anything about it. And you could tell immediately when they open their mouth, because none of the things that they think are important are actually the things that matter to a real anesthesiologist. Their priorities are all out of whack. And you could tell by every action.
Surgeons. I live with them all the time.
But you could tell immediately, right? It's like there's almost nothing they can do or say that doesn't expose them to you, because you know what an anesthesiologist is. And there's plenty, they might be able to fool people who don't know anything about anesthesiology, but they're never going to fool you. There's just like night and day. There's no comparison. They just aren't at any level capable of doing that. That's what it's like with Aristoi. And the problem for us is we don't have any. So, there's nobody around to look at a president or a CEO and go, no, nothing you're saying or doing makes you fit for this role. You should not be doing that. And so as a result, there's nobody to say the emperor has no clothes, because none of us know that you're supposed to have clothes on. We're like, nobody ever told us. We have no basis for comparison. And that's what keeps the system perpetuating. That's how we keep getting inappropriate people in charge, is because we've never had a fully appropriate person. We have no real basis for comparison. It's like the anesthesiology department eternally having been run by nobody who's an anesthesiologist. If that were the circumstances, you wouldn't know what you were missing. And neither are we.
We had to change that. I mean, I was one person that you come to these small communities, a hospital, and the surgeon is in charge and said, why? Right? And you had to handle it very deftly, politically, to change it.
Yes. It's hard, right? It's hard.
But it does get done. A lot of it is personality. A lot of it is politicking, as you know. You pick an advocate, most powerful one, and get him on your side.
Yeah.
But that's where that is. Well, I want to say in the political systems, though, one of the things that I find very interesting when presidencies end is to read about the underbelly of the presidency. Not just Donald Trump, Barack Obama, George Bush Jr., George Bush Sr., Bill Clinton, because then you really get to see how the systems work. And so I'm reading about the underbelly of the Trump presidency. It's absolutely terrifying.
Right.
No.
Right. That's where it gets really interesting.
Yes.
Yeah. And is it Phil and then Donald?
No, Donald. Donald
Okay.
first.
Okay, Donald, go ahead.
First to Joseph. There are two types of people, those who know calculus and those that don't. Similar to the
I can't believe you.
Are you trying to make me cry? I mean, literally.
Are you
I
making
mean,
it?
Jesus.
Are you being hard at him, Donald?
well, I told the math joke of the similar type, but this is the engineering version.
This will be my last week here.
No, he didn't mean that.
And for Rick,
Uh-oh.
there's an old Peter Sellers movie where he's a hospital administrator who has a wonderful system. Everyone, when they're admitted, they determine their net worth. And they cannot be discharged until the bill equals that number.
What's the name of that movie?
Where does it hurt? I think, but it's from the 70s.
I can find it.
And I don't know much about American Indian, but I have watched in the last year or so several. If you go to Amazon Prime or Netflix and search for Swedish movies, the Swedes are somewhat more reflective on this issue. And they have a lot of movies on, look for things like Sami culture, which are the reindeer herders that really, I don't think they knew that they're part of, they just had these reindeer herds up on the Arctic Circle, and then the Norwegians claimed all their part going up, and the Swedes claimed all their part, and the Finns claimed a lot of it, and then the Russians, and they didn't know these four countries existed.
Right.
And they just, because they just followed the place where they could graze their reindeer herds. And so they go back and forth, and they speak sometimes Swedish, sometimes Finnish, sometimes their Sami language, sometimes a little Russian. Mostly they avoid contact, but they're very good movies, I think. I can't think of the titles of any, but I've watched several. The Swedes kind of are discovering, probably due to iron ore mining, that there are people that live up there because they went up there to mine the iron ore deposits and discovered, hey, there's a whole people that live here. And they went through, teaching them language, leaving them alone, different things. And the movies sort of, I think, are pretty perceptive. They're not necessarily, I think one I watched was actually made by some Sami cult, and it's quite interesting. They are clearly second class. Their skin they're not as fair. Sometimes they have darker hair. I don't really know, but when you're looking for indigenous movies, I think to see how another country deals with a similar problem is helpful. And a lot of this is like trying to get fish to explain water to you. When we talk about, we're immersed in modernity, and it's very hard. Our own physics has this problem of trying to come up with what's the universe like as a whole, because we're just in it. And if you could step outside, a lot of its structural elements might be quite apparent, but how do you understand that structure when you're within the structure? And that's what you see in Einstein's general theory of relativity. You're all inside the equations. It's hard to understand them, and I don't. But that's enough. You guys just throw up so much stuff that I scribble little things.
I have a quick comment for you, Donald, if I may.
What?
May I have a quick comment? Just a quick comment.
Sure.
Those cultures, those Nordic cultures, in my experience, for the most part, are pretty homogeneous. And so they have a whole different way. And I'm speaking, I haven't been to Denmark and Sweden and Switzerland, but I've been to Iceland. And I showed up in Iceland, and it's hard to miss, right? And so it was a pretty homogeneous culture, and I was really surprised.
Yeah.
And so the history that they had from way, way back didn't involve the other. It was just them. And so they evolved in a different way.
Mm-hmm.
That's my comment about
it. Well, I'm clicking the mute button again.
Sorry.
Go ahead, Phil.
Yeah, I have a quick comment, and then I want to say something about Joseph's comment. The first one is the Donald, since he told a joke. I remember in the 60s, so this would be maybe 68 or something, there was a wonderful cartoon of this guy in the hospital. So Sharon might enjoy this as well. And he's got happy faces growing all over his body. So this is really early. This is really early with the happy faces. And a team of doctors was in there, and they say, I'm afraid we're going to have to operate, which is really, really early to take a look at the cover up of the happy face, the real deep culture. So that's kind of interesting. Yeah.
Can't have this going on all over you. You are way too happy. We're going to have to operate.
Yeah. So anyway, to address Joseph's question, like I only have a personal answer, and that really has to do with my art. I remember, I may have told this story already because it's really essential to my art, because I was doing very modernist stuff, very sort of in the line avant-garde stuff, and then it sort of broke away from that in a very surprising way. Then I started painting fallen angels when I was at Penn State. And I came home one day, with the philosophy graduate student as my roommate. And I said, I discovered the missing link, right? And he was like, okay, he's interested because that sounds really important. He says, so I said, the missing link is mankind. Because human beings are actually two beings. There are mankind's, which we are all born into. We all are there. And then there's humans, which in that way could transform themselves to a higher level of being human. And unfortunately, most people are just part of mankind. But my paintings is more pessimistic than some of you are. Because even if you transform yourself into being human, you are a fallen angel. Because there's something within the human psyche that's even more complex than nature, more complex than civilization. It's our own inner being that we can't even sort out ourselves. And in order to so they all my fallen angels have wings, but well, not all of them. Most of them have fallen wings, but they can't fly, but they want to fly. They have aspirations to to, in a sense, reach into the other world, or the transcendent world, or the infinite. Okay, and but they can't fly, and they're stuck there. And that's why, earlier on I made the comment, like true love is unrequited.
Oh,
Because I know, and you felt sorry for me because
yes.
because I think your aspirations, if you really want to be human, is you understand your own incapacity to reach that level. And so you're stuck in a kind of a love for the thing that you want to be, but it's always unrequited. And true love, therefore, should not allow you to just, oh, well, forget it. I never care for that anyways, right? Because you care for it. That's what makes you human. And you want to transcend even that. So, I finally came to the conclusion, it was also at the same time at Penn State, that because of the complexity of dealing with not only the world, the civilization, the politics, and our own inner psyche, our inner spirit, our inner soul, that in a sense, all you could do is, with your limited knowledge, live as beautiful a life as you can. That's all you really can do. Not that it would be perfect, because you are a fallen angel that will never be perfect. And I'll tell you this story. I think I might have told this before. I used to go out collecting rocks at the beach, and I sort them, and the ones I didn't meet my quality of beauty, I would return them to the beach. And this was really good stuff that didn't quite make the cut. So I returned it to the beach in a pile, hoping somebody else would find the beauty in them. So I'm the only one that has the background story to this. So I was, looking for rocks, and on my way back, I passed by that pile, and a dad and his child, which is maybe 6 months old, was there, and the dad was like picking it up, like, oh, like this is what a treasure trove. In fact, I made that comment, what a treasure trove you guys found, right? And I walked by, and I was pleased with it. And the dad said to the child, I told you not to suck on that rock, right? Because the child was doing his thing. And so I walked by, and the child, I guess because the dad yelled at him, took the rock out of his mouth and made a gesture like this, off the
Well, then you suck on it.
No, really, it was like, to me, I was stuck in my own mind. I sort of thought, I think quickly, unconsciously, like, oh, that's something I rejected already. Come on now, but you slobber all over it. And so I didn't make a comment. I wasn't unfriendly. I didn't make a comment. I walked by, and about 20, 30 yards later, I realized I made a mistake.
Right.
But it was too late. It was such a beautiful gesture he made. He was willing to give me the most precious thing he had in the world.
Right.
And I didn't recognize it.
Right.
But I did recognize it like a bit later, but I couldn't come back.
Right.
And said to the child, like, thank you very much, because that would be interfering with the father's relationship with the child. But if I had acted at that moment, I would have thanked the child, or said, thank you, you're so wonderful, thank you for sharing. And the father would not be able to say anything, because at that moment, it was just gesture. That was one of the saddest moments I experienced, because I knew it was my fault. It was my fault that I didn't recognize it. That was my limitation. So, but I recognized the beauty of it. And, I hope that at a later point, I would not make the same sort of mistake. So this is sort of my answer of the limited mind in terms of recognizing the unlimited world, right?
Yeah.
I just didn't recognize it
Yeah.
quickly enough, right? It's like this down the stairwell conversation. Somebody made a remark to you, and you walk downstairs, and you're at the bottom of the staircase. I said, dang, I should have said that. but it's too late.
Yes.
So,
Oh, you
so
run back up and say it.
what? I
You run
should.
back up and say it.
Yeah, right. And maybe that will work, but I think in this case, because of father, I would cause a conflict there, so I didn't do it. So that was too bad. My my apologies. I apologize to all of you for making that mistake.
No. Can I say something, Phil?
Yeah.
I think make some choices in life. And one of the choices I made, and this is part of my Christian heritage, and I told you I come by it honestly, and I distilled it into my own, that there is a joy in the journey, if only you see it. And that's your choice. And I want to share something with you. We're here talking about, the meritocracy and how societies are set up for the disadvantaged. And so I want to share very briefly an experience I had this Saturday. So, I volunteer at the Free Clinics of America, which is an inner city clinic. And the CEO asked me last week to come on a Saturday because they were doing a community outreach. And I said, I'd never been there. So I went. And so it's in Donald Trump's country, though. The poor part of Donald Trump's country, if you can believe it. It's called Lake Worth. So I get there and I'm driving down the street and I can't find my way. And a cop comes up behind me because, I'm in a BMW. It looks like it's got drugs in there. And so he kind of scopes me out, pulls alongside me. And I said, I'm lost. He doesn't help me. He just looks and sees an old lady. So he blows her off. But I finally find my way and I go, it's a huge park that they had set up for the homeless. You could get barbered, you could get your hair cut, you could get the shower, you could get your clothes washed, you could get clothes, and then as a physician, you could get health screening. And this went on for about 8 hours. And I walked out of there and I said, yes, and it was driven by corporate donations. In fact, the big trailer with the shower just impressed me because it had a corporate logo on it. And we had about 30 or 40 homeless people in there. They got showers, they got a haircut, they got a meal, they got clothes, they got referred to the clinic. And so what I'm trying to say is despite all we talk about here, there are little pockets of kindness and goodness. And I came home on Saturday evening, had a great shower, and I was the happiest person ever because I was just relieved of all the things you see on the news that are not good. Here was this thing that went on once a month to help these people.
It's a beautiful
Well,
thing.
thank you. Thank you for what you do. Really.
That's my story.
Yeah, it's the interesting thing about any culture is that it's never just one thing. It's always a mix of who it is now and who its ancestors were and who its descendants are going to be all at the same time. It's always in a process of change, and the change often involves internal tug of wars between opposing groups. One group might say, well, you shouldn't give anything to homeless people. If you try to give them food, we'll arrest you. And then another group will say, it's yeah, you should help homeless people, and here we're going to help you to do that. Let's all work together. And those things will happen at the exact same time in the same culture because it doesn't agree with itself. It's struggling to figure out who it's going to become, like we all are. There's this process of unfolding. So it's easy in a discussion like this one to, like any of these, to as you sort of suggested here and as Phil said earlier, to focus entirely on the negative. And it's possible to walk out of one of these discussions feeling let down by having spent so much time looking at, genocide and slavery and warfare and all that. But, it's never meant, at least Kenneth Smith's stuff and my stuff, it's never meant as a condemnation of modernism. That modernism is one thing and that thing is bad. It's never meant that way. It's always meant as trying to feel out the architecture of modernism, its internals. How does it work? How does it live and how does it breathe? What can we figure out about the future and about our alternatives based on how this works, as opposed to how other things have worked? So, I have a friend who is a very good friend. He's very smart, but he won't study existentialist philosophy. He says he'd be depressed all the time. He needs philosophy to give him that escape that Kenneth Smith says is the alternative to existentialism. But maybe that's less a critique of existential philosophy and more a critique of existential philosophers, because maybe we don't spend enough time focusing on the good parts that go with the bad parts and how
Yes.
they're side by side with each other.
Yes.
And they're often directly related to each other. Sometimes one person's act of cruelty inspires other people to be extra kind. So they see that and they're like, well, I don't want to be that person. And maybe I hadn't been paying attention to that part of my life until I saw that person exemplify who I don't want to be. And so I'm going to change my path. And maybe I'll be kinder tomorrow than I was today. Now, all kinds of complicated interrelationships are going on all the time in these systems. One of the things that Kenneth Smith talks about modernism is that, like every previous epoch, it has many, many important parts of it that are not modern, but that are medieval or archaic or even indigenous in some cases, that are survivals that haven't been exterminated and are still woven into the fabric of the culture. And that's partially why, for example, attempts like the boarding school system to exterminate indigenous culture by forcing them all to be, as much as possible like good white Christians, why those things fail is because they don't understand how complex the weave of somebody's life is. And they don't know how to find all of the indigenous things to exterminate them. And so even after their best efforts, you'll still get generations of people who come out and say, well, I lost all the obvious things you knew about, but I've kept all these other things. So like maybe we're still kind to each other, in a way that you didn't teach us to be, but we learned from our grandma, when we were little babies, and you couldn't get rid of it in us. And that's what we'll build on going forward, maybe. So
I thought about us, because if those rich people didn't make enough money, they couldn't do this whole spread. Because I'm sure I looked at it, at least 50 or 60 grand with all the water, the plumbing, the electricity, things they gave away.
yeah, there's a lot of good in the world, and all of that is that's the seeds of the future.
But what did the Romans ever do for us?
I love that speech. I love that speech. Sharon, have you seen the movie he's talking about?
No. What is it?
Monty Python and the Life of Brian.
Oh, Monty Python. I think way back, one of the disadvantages of working as hard as I work is that you sat down to see a movie, you fell asleep because you're so sleep deprived chronically. And so that's what I'm doing now. I can find it somewhere.
This of all the Monty Python films, this is the one you most need to see. It's on the short list of the greatest comedies of all time. And it's because it postulates the idea that at the same time that Jesus was born, there was this other guy down the street named Brian. And he wasn't as famous or well known, but he was caught up in the same era. And so they have a great time with this movie. They critique so many things. They critique religion. They critique leftist revolutionary movements and how they squabble amongst themselves. And what Donald's talking about is a speech where they're trying to get all fired up about how awful the Roman Empire is. And it backfires and leads into a discussion of all the great things they got from the Roman Empire that they never had before. And by the end, they're all like, you're making this revolution hard. Stop telling me all the good things I got. It's a hilarious speech.
So can I just say, looking ahead in Kenneth Smith, and this is for you, Phil, art becomes so important. 7.3 is soul, ego, and art. And then 7.4 is spirit, ego, and art. And they're hard to read, so you better study up because I'm coming at you with all the questions.
Uh-oh.
Outstanding. So yeah, let's do that next time. Let's dig into 7.2, 7.3, and 7.4.
I enjoy this time together.
Well, yes, so do I. I like it a lot. In fact, I was driving home on Saturday and I said, I got to tell these guys about it. Our Mythos and Logos. This kindness just kind of stuck out.
So Joseph, are you changing your mind? That
No,
this will
he's
be
coming
this
back.
will
He's
be your
Oh
coming
no,
last
I'm
time.
coming back, but I tell you what I am going to do is I am going to learn two things next year: my Civil War and calculus now. So it's been good it's inspiring.
Yes, it is. Well, the Civil War lectures by Eric Fuller are just excellent. You enjoy them.
Yeah, I love this time too. This is one of my very favorite times of each week. You guys are great.
But do you run meetup from 11, 12, 1, 2? Because I always notice there are several times and I don't understand it.
Yeah, I don't know how it's expressed on Meetup, but when David puts together an invite for the Seattle group and for the Florida group, and he says it's for this one time, and then we sort of stretch it out to 3 hours, even if Meetup doesn't fully understand.
Oh,
So-
yeah, okay. Because I signed up today on my phone because I was not at home. And then I saw I signed up for the 11 o'clock class. I said, that's not going to work.
Yeah, no, I only do this one time slot, 3 hours once a week.
Wow.
This is what
I appreciate it a lot because I'm learning a lot of philosophy and I'm also interested and ignited to learn more. Otherwise, it just went right over my head. It's not doing that now.
Yay!
And I'm actually starting to understand why systems theory actually the flaws in it, which is something that I've actually thought about for a while. Like a lot of people have been expressing to me that there's the systems thinking approach that has been actually harmful. But in terms of systems, I also think in terms of systems as well. So now I'm getting the other end of it. So
Right.
that really is opening my mind. It's
But
really,
here is something that I noticed, Rick and company, to follow on this. So I interviewed about 30 homeless people, right? And we talk about opportunity. But if you listen to these people and I talk to them, why are you in the street? Spirit, there's a poverty of the mind that I was able to identify. That is interesting to me. You know, there's this one guy, he told me that every time he earned money, he went to gamble and he bought a car for 15 grand. And sure enough, when I walked outside, I saw it. He did have it. But he came to see me because there was an accident and he had metal in his foot. And so I spent some time talking to him. And he was very confident that this was the lifestyle he wanted to lead. Because in addition to all the people there were people there, corporate entities there. If you gave them their name, they would help to place you in a shelter. Not all of them wanted to do that. They wanted to be on the street. So,
right.
So the system could do so much, Joseph. But then it's up to the character types that Heraclitus talks about, and how they think. So it's a balancing act of it.
it is. No, I've actually kind of come into those types of circumstances where sometimes people just don't want to come in, and it's hard to understand, but you can't impose the will on others either. That's an important thing.
And
Well,
that go ahead, Phil.
Well, it basically comes down to the fact that you finally have respect for others. I remember several years ago, before San Diego was inundated with a lot of homeless people, I was surprised. I was walking around up the San Diego River, which is really a creek, but it's called the river. And I was just doing a regular walk, and then like in the middle of it, there was a lot of homeless people. And I was kind of shocked, because I had suddenly run into these people and I felt apologetic that I was interrupting them. I could have easily not felt apologetic because like I was there righteously and they were not there righteously according to the law. But, I didn't, apologize to them, but they knew that I just wanted to move and not disturb them. I had to move through it because they were all over the place. And that was just leave them alone. But it's like, like allow them what little dignity they have left in that situation, rather than say, what the hell are you guys doing here?
Right.
I'm
Right.
just taking a nature walk and you guys are disturbing me. I mean, I think you have to respect human beings on a certain basic level, to at least allow them to be what they are. And otherwise, you're taking it all away, and that's not right in itself. So I think we're faced with that more and more
Mhm.
as the corporate structures are squeezing more and more people into that situation, and so many people who were middle class or at least lower middle class has fallen into that trap. And they're kind of shocked that, like now they're not living in the river, but they're living in the cars, in a lot. And so we have to be empathetic, at least to that degree, to them, to the
Right.
plight. And not because like maybe someday I'll be in that plight. No, because they're human beings.
Right. Right. Absolutely.
And dignity is the operative word there, because that's
Yeah.
what that exercise was all about. It's giving them some dignity. Now, before we go, I gotta know this. What are you eating? That big brown.
I was thinking the same thing.
Me?
Yeah,
Yes.
the meat or the
Ah.
Yeah.
sticky.
So
What is it?
the Pacific Northwest Coast indigenous peoples used to eat a lot of fish and a lot of berries.
Yes.
I've just sort of stumbled because of the nature of my diet and my allergies. I've sort of stumbled upon doing the same thing. I eat a lot of smoked salmon, and I eat a lot of raspberries and cherries and other fruits.
So what's in that thing you're eating? That big thing? It looks
So the big brown thing that I was eating was that was smoked
like
salmon.
a phallic structure.
Oh, that's
It's
smoked salmon. That's pretty cool.
It was a strip of smoked salmon. Yeah.
So it's naturally smoked during this heat crisis.
Yeah.
No, definitely not.
What's the temperature out there actually now?
Today it's 107.
Oh, yes. Oh, it's hot. Oh, that's what it is. Native candy. Oh,
Yeah.
king pepper.
It's
That's
a
pretty
local
cool.
it's a local fishing business run by indigenous peoples. They fish on
Okay.
the Columbia River,
That's fantastic.
That's
and then they
fantastic.
smoke it and they
Thank you
sell it at the farmers markets.
Thank you. It's nothing I recognize, and I've been curious.
That's what I was wondering it myself. I was like, wonder what that is. I was like, you can't offer me any.
Well, it's that and a bag of cherries. I don't know if you can see them.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's what
Cherries,
I've been
I
working
see.
on here. So anyway,
All right. Okay. So
So-
next week we'll move on. Right.
yes. Next week we move on, and next week it'll be about 20 degrees cooler than it is today. Thank God. So we'll see you all then.
Yes. Thank you, guys. This was
Thank
very
you,
good.
Thank you,
everyone.
everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Brighten my week.
Yay.
Yes, thanks.
Thanks, Joseph.